If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 76, Chapter 74, Inter High. Under Alexandra's guidance, Fukuda Soo underwent intense training for the next 2 weeks. Although Alexandra wasn't thrilled about working in Japan when she had planned for a vacation, her workload mainly consisted of directing the team's training sessions. The strategic planning was Tsuna's responsibility, while Nijimura handled administrative matters. The salary was very enticing. However, she also accepted the position because she was promised free travel around Japan whenever she had free time. Tsuna would cover all her expenses, making it even harder to decline. Tsuna had his own training to focus on, and having Alexandra in Japan would provide valuable assistance. He recognized the potential in his team, making Alexandra the ideal choice. Having informed her that his team had undergone solid training in the previous weeks, Alexandra was initially skeptical. However, to her surprise, the team was in excellent condition. Seeing their impressive shape, Alexandra adjusted their training plan. It aimed to challenge them further while allowing room for recovery, ensuring they could progress significantly. Alexandra looked baffled, holding a list of exercises in her hand. She addressed Tsuna, who was seated across from her, and Nijimura stood behind Tsuna, observing the conversation with intrigue. Wondering about the exercises listed, she questioned Tsuna, "Why do you want me to include these exercises? They're not typical, you know." Tsuna responded with a confident smile, "Trust me on this. Follow my instructions. You're in for a pleasant surprise." Alexandra shrugged her shoulders in response. She quipped, "Okay, fine. But if these exercises don't work out, don't blame me, all right." Tsuna smiled while nodding at her. Soon, the month of Inter-High had kicked off. The elimination phase had begun in Shizuoka Prefecture before progressing to the playoffs. Alexandra examined the list of teams in their region and seemed convinced that securing a spot in the playoffs would be a walk in the park. In the month that followed, they completely dominated the elimination phase. Their performance caused a sensation not only in their region but also in others. Similar events unfolded in Akita Prefecture, where a team showcased impeccable defense and ruled the region. The same pattern emerged in Kyoto Prefecture in the far west, where a single team emerged as the dominant force. Single teams completely took over 3 regions, and what made this especially noteworthy was that 2 of these teams had a member of the Generation of Miracles, which wasn't all that surprising given their reputation. On the other hand, Fukuda Soo had seemingly emerged from nowhere and became the dark horse of this year's Inter-High. This unexpected turn of events set off discussions and excitement throughout the nation. In an advanced gym facility within a prestigious school with modern architecture that gleamed around the building, boasting cutting-edge design and materials. The structure was a testament to the school's elite status. A teenager with black hair, sporting thick glasses, approached another teen with red hair. The red-haired one was in the middle of wiping sweat off his face after a workout. The bespectacled teen had a file in his hand and looked excited as he reported some astounding news, and another team stood out in this Inter-High. It was a team from Shizuoka Prefecture, Fukuda Soo Academy. They had taken over everything in the south. The red-haired teenager mumbled to himself, clearly deep in thought, "Fukuda Soo Academy. That should be his school." Curious, the black-haired teen asked, "Do you have a friend there, Captain?" The red-haired teenager, his mismatched eyes glinting with an eerie intensity, grinned at the comment. "A friend, you could call him that, but ultimately, he's just another opponent who will bow before us soon." The bespectacled black-haired teenager acknowledged this statement with a nod. The red-haired teen collected his belongings and headed for the exit. But before leaving the gym, he issued a command. "Get me a list of all the players from that school by tomorrow morning." "Got it, Captain Akashi." The bespectacled teen saluted, and Akashi departed the gym. Akashi strolled down the school corridor, a quiet confidence in his steps. His thoughts centered on the message from Tsunayoshi Kazama, and a subtle smile crept onto his face. "So, this was your way of saying hello?" His expression shifted, and he muttered with a hint of disappointment, "A pity, no matter what you do. I will come on top." Akashi stopped and gazed out the window in the direction of Shizuoka. His eyes, unique with one bearing a red circle, glinted as he asserted, "As in the end, I am absolute." In one of Tokyo's largest gymnasiums, an intense basketball game unfolded. On one side, you had Seirin High, a youthful and spirited team. On the other, stood Tou Academy, a team that had steadily climbed the ranks in recent years, now hosting the ace of the Generation of Miracles. The situation was dire for Seirin. Kagami, one of their key players, had been sidelined, creating a noticeable gap in their team's performance. To make matters worse, right before the first half concluded, Aomine stepped onto the court and casually approached Kagami. He greeted him, suggesting that they should have some fun. As the game kicked off, Kagami, after a shaky start, found his footing and began to push back. He forced Aomine to up his game, and with every passing moment, the tension in the match grew thicker. "Whoa, Midorima, who's your bet on now?" A blonde-haired teenager asked Midorima, sitting right next to him in the audience. Midorima, focused and quiet, adjusted his glasses, watching the game intently. Midorima had been training relentlessly after their defeat to Fukuda Soo. But a new element, Seirin High, had appeared on the scene and surprisingly bested them. He couldn't figure out what went wrong, and it was gnawing at him. Kuroko's addition to the team had been a positive change, but now there was a new element, Kagami, who could hold his own against Aomine. This left Midorima feeling perplexed. "Oh, Shintaro, what a coincidence!" Suddenly, a voice interrupted his thoughts. He and his friend turned to see a black-haired teenager walking alongside a beautiful blonde foreigner. Midorima adjusted his glasses and quizzically addressed Tsuna. "Tsuna? What brings you to Tokyo?" The blonde teenager standing alongside Midorima wore a surprised expression. He clearly hadn't anticipated that Midorima had friends beyond the confines of Tioko's circle. Tsuna offered a nonchalant shrug in response to Midorima's query, saying, "Just some business here." Turning to Alexandra, Tsuna added, "She's here for sightseeing. Since her favorite pupil is currently on the court, we figured we'd catch the game," Tsuna added. Midorima's eyes widened in surprise, and he inquired, "Disciple? Who are you talking about?" "You're quite familiar with him," Tsuna smirked, which earned an annoyed look from Midorima. On the other hand, the blonde teenager leaned in, keenly interested in the conversation. Tsuna continued, "I'm referring to the red-haired guy who previously bested both of you." Upon hearing this, Midorima swiftly turned toward the court, where Kagami was contributing 2 points to Seirin with a powerful dunk. "That guy is her student," Midorima whispered in surprise. He focused on Alexandra, concluding that she was no ordinary foreigner. Simultaneously, the blonde-haired teenager looked puzzled and asked, "Hey, do we know each other?" Tsuna smiled and replied, "Of course, one of my teammates had a bit of a beef against you, Kai's Ryota." Kai's tilted his head in confusion at this. Chapter 77, Chapter 75, Seirin High vs Tou Academy. Kai's laughed awkwardly and replied, "I'm not intentionally making enemies, you know. But it's a part of being famous, right? Haters are bound to show up," Kai's sighed, somewhat narcissistically. Ignoring Kai's words, Midorima adjusted his glasses and gave Alexandra an inquisitive look. Meanwhile, Tsuna also ignored Kai's words and chuckled, noticing Midorima's curiosity. "She was also my teacher when I was a kid," he grinned. Midorima's eyes widened as he shifted his gaze between Tsuna, who watched the game nonchalantly, and Alexandra, who appeared to be interested. She observed Fukuda Soo's dominance during the elimination phase, making her question the basketball state in Japan. Yet, her overall impression was shaken by the game unfolding before her. Still, Alexandra scoffed when Tsuna referred to her as his teacher. She felt that she had barely taught him anything. Although she had provided training plans, Tsuna often took the initiative in figuring out what worked best for him. In her opinion, she didn't deserve the title of Tsuna's teacher. Yet, Tsuna recognized the value of Alexandra's extensive experience in the WNBA. He understood that he might have struggled to navigate the intricacies of advanced basketball training drills without her guidance. "So, Kagami was your fellow student?" Midorima inquired as his attention returned to the game. Tsuna offered a casual shrug and nodded, saying, "Yeah, you could say that." Midorima turned his gaze towards Kagami with a new level of scrutiny. He realized that he might have underestimated Kagami. Clearly, Kagami was more than just an average player. The fact that he shared the same mentor as Tsuna, whom Midorima considered on par with the Generation of Miracles, piqued his interest. Although they had the same teacher, Tsuna and Kagami hadn't really spoken much. In the past, they played basketball on different courts in the US. Tsuna was occupied with his training and business, leaving little time to meet anyone else for something casual. As Tsuna watched the game, it was clear things weren't going well for Seirin. He turned to Alexandra and asked, do you want to meet Taiga after the game? Alexandra paused for a moment, deep in thought. She finally replied, I want to, but it seems you're getting ready to leave. The rest of the players from Fukuda Soo had already left for Kanagawa for the inter-high playoffs, and Tsuna needed to catch up with them. Although the playoffs were still 2 weeks away, Tsuna saw it as a good opportunity to switch their surroundings before the tournament. Tsuna shrugged and said, well, there's not much more to see here. Seirin will lose, and we need to head to Kanagawa soon. Midorima frowned as he heard this and turned his attention back to the game. Despite Seirin being in a tough spot, considering his experience playing against them, Seirin wasn't the type to give it up. As Tsuna got up from his seat, Midorima wondered how Tsuna could be so sure about the game's outcome. Tsuna kept talking to Alexandra, saying, so, wouldn't it be a good idea to go now? I think everyone's already in Kanagawa. But if you'd like to stay a bit and meet Taiga, I can arrange for someone to pick you up and take you to Kanagawa separately. Alexandra nodded and replied, well, I can catch up with him later. I'll go with you this time. Midorima overheard their conversation and inquired, are you leaving soon? The game isn't even over yet. We don't need to watch the rest of the game. Tsuna then turned to Kai's and added, see you on Kanagawa. Maybe we'll have a chance to play against each other. As Tsuna walked away with Alexandra, he left them with a parting remark, that is, if you manage to beat Tou Academy. Midorima watched Tsuna walk away and pondered deeply. Midorimaki, who was that? Kai's couldn't help but ask. Midorima glanced at Kai's before responding, he's a former player from Tiako too. What? Seriously, why haven't I heard of him before? Is any good? Midorima shook his head at Kai's inquiry. Is he any good? Midorima took a moment to think before replying, he had to leave the country during his first year, so you wouldn't have had a chance to get to know him. But, in terms of his skills, I'd say he's on the same level as us, Midorima concluded as he adjusted his glasses. Kai's eyes widened in disbelief, and he asked again, really? He's that good? Have you not heard of the 3 powerhouses that ruled the entire region by themselves? Kai's looked puzzled when he heard this. Midorima sighed and clarified, you probably know about 2 of them. Rakuzenhai in Kyoto, Yasenhai in Akita, and the third one was Fukuda Soo Academy from Shizuoka. Midorima fixed his eyes on the game, which had reached a critical moment. Seirin, even with Kagami and Kuroko, couldn't prevent Aomine from taking control and securing the win for Tou Academy. Kai's was still processing what he had just heard from Midorima when the latter suddenly stood up. Midorima said, if Kaijo manages to beat Tou in the playoffs, you'll face Fukuda Soo. Kai's furrowed his brow in confusion. Midorima talked as if Fukuda Soo winning their first playoff game was a certainty. Looking at Midorima, Kai's thought, Midorimaki seems to hold that guy from earlier in high regard. Kai's then glanced at the disappointed Aomine on the court as his eyes flashed in excitement and added, we'll see how it goes. Midorima nodded and then walked away, leaving a parting remark, I'll be keeping an eye on the playoffs. Don't make a fool of yourself. What? Are you heading to Kanagawa? Shudoko has a tradition of doing our summer training in Kanagawa. In a week, they would be leaving for that place. Midorima strolled away from the spectator seats, suddenly recollecting something. Now that I think about it. Midorima muttered. His nonchalant expression transformed into a smirk. The resort was called Kazama's Family Resort. It appeared that Shudoko would soon cross paths with Fukuda Soo again. Unaware of Midorima's abrupt change in mood, Kai's chuckled and assured, I'll give it my all. Meanwhile, a heavy cloud of disappointment hung over the Seirin team on the court. They had just let slip their chance to make it to the playoffs. Glancing at the scoreboard, it became painfully clear that Seirin wasn't merely losing, they were being completely dominated. They couldn't help but stare at Aomine, who seemed more like a monster. Kuroko, in particular, gazed upon Aomine's solitary figure with a deep sadness. Momoi shared Kuroko's melancholy as she, too, gazed at Aomine. She then shifted her attention to a name in a file labeled Fukuda Soo Academy. Maybe this will lift his spirits a bit, Momoi whispered to herself. Chapter 78, Chapter 76, Kuroko's Small Reunion. A week passed, and Seirin was still reeling from their defeat against Tou. They suffered losses in their last 2 games against Meisei and Sen Shinkan. Back to their regular daily schedule, it was clear that the team was finding it difficult to move past the losses. Even during their practice sessions, they struggled. But with Teppei Kyoshi back from treatment, Seirin's morale began to improve. Even though they had a friendly game against some local teams, it was evident that their minds weren't quite in the game. Recognizing that the Winter Cup was their final shot this year, their coach, Riko Aida, called to kick off a summer training camp. She was aware that their fundamentals fell short compared to other elite teams. They had arrived at a beautiful resort. Look at this place, it's incredible. Teppei Kyoshi, a teenager with moderately long brown hair that fell around his dark eyes, couldn't help but admire the resort where they'd be staying for the next few weeks. Indeed, I picked a resort that's perfect for us. A teenager with shoulder-length caramel hair beamed with pride, her chest puffed out. She continued, and an excellent basketball court is here for our training. Wow, coach, you're amazing! The Seirin team couldn't help but exclaim. Once they entered the resort, they noticed Kuroko standing still, gazing ahead at someone approaching with a basketball. Kuroko, what's going on? Kagami inquired. But Kuroko appeared to be in shock, his body trembling. Seeing the person with the basketball brought tears to his eyes as he whispered, Agiwara. The rest of the Seirin team was taken aback and worried by Kuroko's abrupt change in demeanor. Moments earlier, Agiwara appeared to notice the stir in the crowd. He turned toward the gathering by the gate, his eyes growing wide with surprise. As he spotted Kuroko among them, a broad smile spread across Agiwara's face. He rushed to the group, exclaiming, Kuroko, it's been ages. As Agiwara got closer, he spoke with a cheerful laugh, haha, you folks must be Kuroko's teammates from Seirin. I'm Shigehiro Agiwara, Kuroko's childhood friend. It's nice to meet you all. The others hesitated before responding and turned to Kuroko, who wiped away his tears and asked, his voice choked, Agiwara, are you still playing basketball? Kuroko's strained voice tugged at Agiwara's heartstrings. He nodded sheepishly and replied, I met someone who helped me at my lowest, so I decided to continue playing. Understanding that Kuroko and Agiwara needed some time, the rest of the group exchanged glances and decided to step away discreetly. I apologize for interrupting your reunion, but Shigehiro still has more training to complete with us. However, a voice interrupted the moment before they could leave the two old friends alone. The voice drew everyone's attention to a black-haired teenager donning a team jersey, standing confidently with someone else behind him, appearing like a loyal servant. As the new arrival made his way forward, the others unconsciously cleared a path for him. In shock, Kuroko gazed at the newcomer and muttered, Kazama and Senior Nijimura. Why you? Kagami, taken aback, pointed a trembling finger at Tsuna and blurted out, how did you end up in Japan? Flashing a reassuring smile at Kagami, Tsuna replied, why not? I can go wherever I please, right? Frustrated and perplexed, Kagami grappled with his thoughts, burdened by the numerous questions raised by Tsuna's unexpected appearance in Japan. However, Kagami ultimately couldn't find the right words and could only vent his frustration with a shout. Arg! The rest of the Seirin team, who were not privy to the conversation in English, watched the scene with confusion. Kagami seems to be acquainted with that guy. But Kuroko also seems to know both of them. What's going on? The entire situation was baffling. First, Kuroko reunited with his childhood friend, and now he was greeting someone else whom Kagami also recognized. The rest of the team could only stand there, whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of the unfolding events. Tsuna shifted his focus to Agiwara, ignoring Kagami's outburst. Captain, can I do the drills later on my own time? I want to talk with Kuroko. Agiwara inquired, addressing Tsuna with respect. Kuroko was taken aback once more by Agiwara addressing Tsuna as his captain. Observing the exchange between the two, Tsuna sighed and agreed, sure, you can complete the drills later on your own time. It's been a while, Tetsuya. I'd love to chat more, but I have some business to take care of. Tsuna addressed Kuroko. He continued, we can catch up later. Nijimura simply nodded at Kuroko before accompanying Tsuna into the resort. As Tsuna entered the building, Seirin couldn't help but notice the name on his jersey, Fukuda Soo Academy. Fukuda Soo. I think I've heard of them, Izuki mumbled. Aida, on the other hand, was visibly taken aback. Kyoshi noticed her reaction and inquired, Riko, are you familiar with them? Aida nodded solemnly, her expression turning serious. She explained, there were 3 renowned powerhouses that dominated their region. The other two had a generation of miracles within their ranks, so it didn't garner as much media attention. However, a new formidable team suddenly appeared, just as strong as the other two powerhouses. They go by the name Fukuda Soo. And their captain, Tsunayoshi Kazama, is rumored to be on the same level as the generation of miracles, especially after his performance in the elimination phase, Aida concluded, her gaze focused on Tsuna. Wait, isn't he a freshman like Kagami and Kuroko? How did he become their captain? When Kuroko casually addressed Tsuna, it dawned on them that Tsuna was their peer. This surprising discovery left the entire team in shock. I'm not entirely certain about the whole captain thing, Kagami said, absorbing the surprising details. But in terms of skill, although I was pretty surprised, I guess it was as expected of him. I actually know that guy. He used to play on the street ball court in Los Angeles occasionally. Really? He's from the States. Hyga exclaimed, clearly taken aback. Kagami continued to explain, yeah, he's from there. I used to play street ball, too, and they had different levels based on your age. Most of the time, you'd only play against people your age. But... Kagami fixed a determined gaze on Tsuna's receding figure, underscoring, that guy, he played on a higher-level street ball court, even against older players. Back then, Kagami had initially assumed Tsuna was older, but with the information from Alexandra, he learned they were actually the same age. The members of Seirin were left feeling stunned. They couldn't shake off the thought that the rumors about Tsuna's skills rivaling the generation of miracles might be accurate. Chapter 79, Chapter 77, Fascinating Situation. Tsuna, where's our coach? Nijimura inquired out of the blue. As they pressed on with their training, they were near the end of their session, engaged in a drill called the lateral shuffle. While maintaining the shuffle, Tsuna replied, she took off last night. Mentioned she wanted to travel around for a bit. What about our training for the next week? Nijimura grumbled, clearly frustrated. Their upcoming playoff against Onidai was just a week away. With the match looming, they needed their coach's guidance to ensure they were in the best possible shape. Understanding Nijimura's concern, Tsuna shook his head. It'll be fine, Tsuna assured him. He believed that making drastic changes to their daily routine just before the match might disrupt their preparations, and it was essential to maintain stability for peak performance. Tsuna continued, let's stick to our regular training regimen. She didn't leave us high and dry. She prepared everything in advance. Nijimura, catching his breath during the shuffle, recalled, you're right. She mentioned leaving something in your room. Tsuna nodded in agreement, and Nijimura's expression cleared up. It seemed that Alexandra had planned her return for the playoff day. She had even sent Tsuna a comprehensive schedule for the upcoming week's training, complete with dietary instructions. I'll provide you with the file later, Tsuna said, taking a deep breath as he finished his set. He turned to Nijimura, who had also completed his training, and added, inform the rest of the team about the schedule. As for the dietary plan, pass it to Sabas. He can arrange for someone to handle it. I want us to focus on training. Nijimura nodded, bowing slightly. Got it. Tsuna acknowledged this with a nod, then turned to the other players, instructing them to freshen up and take a well-deserved rest for the day. Leaving the basketball court, night had fallen. I think it's time for a shower. Tsuna wiped the sweat from his brow and mumbled. A familiar voice responded, you haven't changed at all, have you? You still switch to English when you're thinking out loud. Tsuna turned to see the person who had spoken. Well, you seem different from the last time we met, Shintaro. Midorima chose to ignore those words, adjusting his glasses in a typical fashion. He wasn't eager to acknowledge the changes he had undergone after his defeats against Tsuna and Kuroko. These losses had brought into focus certain deficiencies he hadn't noticed because he was used to playing with monsters on the same team. Tsuna seemed calm as he shook his head in response. My family owns this place. It's no surprise that I know Shadoko had been a regular. This revelation intrigued Tsuna. He had a rough idea that Shadoko held their summer camp at a specific resort in Kanagawa. However, he never expected that this resort was one of his family's properties in Japan. I understand, Midorima replied. His gaze briefly shifted toward the gymnasium in the courtyard. He considered that perhaps Tsuna's ownership might explain the presence of a basketball court here. Turning back to Tsuna, Midorima expressed his concern, I observed your team practicing earlier. Don't you think you're pushing yourselves too hard, especially with a game just a week away. Tsuna shrugged, adopting a nonchalant tone. This is our usual training routine, he casually mentioned, leaving Midorima somewhat stunned by their intense regimen. Tsuna continued, it's not that surprising. Our school is known for having students with exceptional physical abilities. While not every student at Fukuda Soo Academy was inherently gifted, the nature of the school required a certain level of physical prowess from all its students. If not, they wouldn't have an easy life at school. Midorima's brows furrowed as he recalled his own research into Fukuda Soo Academy after learning that Tsuna attended there. Observing Tsuna's casual demeanor about his school, Midorima couldn't help but regard him seriously, thinking, is this guy a force to be reckoned with at his school too? At this moment, Midorima was torn between the idea of whether Tsuna or Akashi was more formidable. The two had prominent backgrounds. Both exuded dominance, having been raised to stand at the apex. The memories of certain issues in Tiako had transformed Akashi's inherent dominance into an extreme force resurfaced as Midorima thought about the guy. Midorima, what's on your left hand? Tsuna inquired with a mischievous grin, causing Midorima to flinch instinctively. Something about Tsuna's expression was a little fishy. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, Midorima replied, it's a pair of chopsticks. According to Ohae's horoscope, they're my lucky item for today. I want them, Tsuna's smirk persisted as he responded, I bet you're about to be surprised again later. Do you dare to bet on these? Although Tsuna's smirk was unsettling, Midorima wasn't the one to back down from a challenge. Ha! I'll see what you got. Midorima boldly accepted Tsuna's challenge, his competitive spirit refusing to yield. Midorima maintained his confident demeanor, his assurance that nothing could faze him apparent in his smile. That was until Tsuna led him to the cafeteria, where Midorima's eyes widened in astonishment. What are you doing here? Midorima was taken aback by the unexpected sight of Kuroko and Kagami eating in the cafeteria. His expression turned into a mix of surprise and anger as he pointed a finger at them. Kuroko, always calm and collected, greeted him with a nod, saying, Hello, Midorima. It's been a while. Kagami, equally bewildered, stood up and pointed back at Midorima, demanding, What are you doing here? Tsuna found amusement in the situation as he shook his head. He then signaled one of the staff members to bring him a meal per his dietary plan. Kagami couldn't hide his confusion, wait, you can do that here? I thought this was a self-serve cafeteria. Midorima, slightly irritated, chimed in, of course he can. He owns the place, you idiot. He handed the promised chopsticks to Tsuna, who smirked as he accepted them. Kagami, feeling perplexed, scratched his head. Observing Midorima go about getting his meal, Kagami wondered, is this guy here for training too? Tsuna took a seat at their table, awaiting his specially prepared meal. Before long, Midorima joined them, and the silence in the air grew heavier, making the atmosphere quite tense. Midorima sighed, attempting to ease the tension, and directed his question to Kuroko, so, are you guys here for a vacation? Before Kuroko could respond, the cafeteria door swung open dramatically, and a crowd entered. They formed three distinct groups based on their togetherness. Awkwardly, everyone exchanged glances before finding separate seats, adhering to their respective groups. One of the groups greeted Tsuna respectfully before settling into their own seats. This seemingly minor interaction drew the attention of everyone present, who regarded Tsuna with a hint of surprise. Shotoku also glanced at Tsuna, but their reaction was less surprised than Seirin's. Midorima, still wearing a frown, noticed Kuroko's surprise when he looked at someone, and he began to think, their whole team is here too? Must be for training. However, when he followed Kuroko's gaze and spotted someone familiar to both of them, he couldn't help but exclaim, Haizaki! Haizaki, noticing their attention, merely clicked his tongue and ignored them, choosing not to engage. The atmosphere grew tense, and amidst the palpable discomfort, Tsuna couldn't resist a smirk, finding the situation rather intriguing. Chapter 80, Chapter 78, Joint Practice. On Shotoku's table. Captain, did we see that guy over there during the friendly game before? Takao whispered to Itsubo, who appeared to be closely observing the scene. Noticing Kuroko and Midorima's reactions, it was clear that they both recognized the mysterious player from Fukuda Soo. Kimura overheard Takao's hushed question and replied, I'm pretty sure there was no player like him in our previous friendly game. Miyagi's brow furrowed in response to this unexpected revelation. Didn't that imply that Fukuda Soo had defeated them without their full strength? Someone acknowledged by the shooter and the sixth man of the generation of miracles couldn't be an average player. On the Seirin's table, the tension hung thick in the air. This is making me uncomfortable. I just want to escape from here. I'm with you on that. The first-year Seirin players were visibly trembling, overwhelmed by the atmosphere. Even Kagane, Izuki, and Hyuga felt the tension in the air. It's really tense in here. Hyuga adjusted his glasses, and Izuki and Kagane agreed with their captain. Conversely, Kaijo appeared unusually thrilled as he exclaimed, "Wow, things are heating up. We'll be training alongside them, and that's a great chance to witness their training, right?" Midorima made a hand gesture, and Kagane translated it for the team. Midorima agrees with Kaijo. Aida's eyes sparkled as she wore a bright smile. This was a unique opportunity to witness how their team compared to one of the powerhouse teams that had dominated the entire region. "Captain, there's something eerie about Coach's smile," Kagane whispered to Hyuga, who couldn't help but notice the unsettling grin on their coach's face. Hyuga adjusted his glasses and sighed, "That usually means she's got something up her sleeve." Whenever she wore that smile, it usually meant Seirin would find themselves pushed to their limits, but they'd always achieve remarkable results. "I can't help but be excited about this," Hyuga admitted with a smirk. The rest of Seirin seemed to share his enthusiasm, except for the first years, who were still trembling from the intense atmosphere in the room. In the midst of all eyes at Tsuna's table, Midorima glanced at Hyuga as he spoke. "So, you were keeping a wild card hidden all along." There was no hiding. Hyuga played in the Interhigh from the beginning. He just happened to forget during our friendly match. "Do you think I'd believe such nonsense?" Tsuna shook his head in response, denying any secrecy. Midorima wasn't convinced. He frowned, looking skeptical. Kuroko said, "But, knowing his character, it's entirely possible, Midorima." Midorima recalled Hyuga's nature and eventually nodded, conceding the point. Kagami, curious about the friendly game between Fukuda Soo and Shutoku, inquired, "You guys played against each other? Who won?" Midorima, clearly irritated, just clicked his tongue in response without answering. Instead of answering Kagami's question, Tsuna sported a smirk and teased, "You know, if you had arrived a bit earlier, you might have another surprise." This got Midorima's attention, and he glanced at Kagami, curious about what surprise Tsuna was hinting at. Kagami, perplexed by Tsuna's remark, scratched his head and asked, "Hey? What do you mean?" Tsuna didn't provide any further explanation. Instead, he shook his head and turned to Kuroko, saying, "I see that you still did it wrong." Kuroko cast his gaze downward, struggling to find the right words. "Your fundamentals are still lacking," Tsuna persisted, and this remark didn't go unnoticed by the Seirin players. Their curiosity was piqued as they overheard the conversation at Tsuna's table. Tsuna had been encouraging Kuroko to improve his physical fitness and foundational basketball skills rather than solely relying on his unique playing style. He had been advocating this approach since their first meeting in middle school. Kuroko had remained focused on perfecting his unique abilities, even seeking advice from Akashi, who saw potential in Kuroko's special skills. Kuroko's ability was undoubtedly valuable, but Tsuna knew it wasn't sufficient in a high-level match. Every player of that caliber possessed extraordinary skills, and relying solely on such trickery wouldn't suffice. That was why Akashi had groomed another player with a stronger foundation to employ the same trick. While that player had lost to Kuroko in the original storyline, it didn't diminish the fact that he was a better fit for a strong and well-rounded team like Rakuzan. However, Kagami was immediately provoked by Tsuna's words and stood up angrily, but Kuroko signaled him to calm down. "That's fine, Kagami," Kuroko told Kagami, who reluctantly sat back down. Kuroko turned back to Tsuna and confessed, "I've come to realize that recently, especially after our loss to Tou Academy." Tsuna raised an inquisitive eyebrow and exchanged a look with Midorima, silently questioning whether Kuroko had finally grasped the point he'd been making since middle school. Midorima, too, exchanged a doubtful look with Tsuna, responding wordlessly, "Perhaps." But before their silent exchange could continue, Kuroko spoke up. "That's why." With a determined expression, Kuroko turned to Tsuna and declared, "I'll learn to apply my misdirection to other aspects of the game." Upon hearing this, Tsuna fell into silence. During their first encounter, Tsuna pointed out the obvious flaws and advantages of Kuroko's low presence, but somehow, his words were misunderstood. Kuroko appeared to have misinterpreted Tsuna's intentions. He exchanged a bewildered glance with Midorima, both puzzled by the conversation. While it was true that Kuroko's misdirection would falter if he drew too much attention by holding the ball, having a solid foundation was fundamental for any athlete, and that's what Tsuna was trying to convey. Tsuna sighed, steering the conversation toward different topics. As they continued to catch up, Midorima occasionally chimed in, but more often than not, he and Kagami clashed in heated arguments. Their personalities were like fire and water, always destined to spark disagreements. However, when Kuroko declared, it rippled through the room, surprising Shotoku's members. Misdirection was already a challenging technique, now, Kuroko aimed to take it further. Nijimura also found this surprising. Although troublesome, Tsuna had mentioned that misdirection wasn't much of an issue with him on the team. But Kuroko's intentions piqued his interest nonetheless. Their time in the cafeteria ended, and the players began to depart one by one. Fukuda Soo was the first to leave, worn out from their day of intense training and eager to rest. Nijimura stayed behind, waiting for Tsuna. Everyone else from Fukuda Soo had already departed. When Tsuna was finally ready to leave, Seirin's coach and Teppei Kiyoshi, one of the uncrowned kings known as the Heart of Steel, awaited him. "Ah, hello there, my name is Riko Aida. I'm currently serving as Seirin's coach." Aida reached out for a handshake, which Tsuna professionally received as he introduced himself formally. As they talked for a while, Aida wanted them to have a practice game during their stay in the resort. Nijimura whispered to Tsuna that it was impossible, considering they had already worn out from their usual drills. Adding more would be overexerting their body, especially since it was not only Seirin. There was also Shotoku. However, Tsuna seemed pretty intrigued by this, as he suggested tweaking a bit of their training drills in the morning, and had a practice game to replace it. In the end, they agreed to do the practice game starting tomorrow. Chapter 81, Chapter 79, Spectating the Inter-High. With that consensus in place, all three teams were busy the following week. In addition to their regular training sessions, they engaged in practice games several times. During these games, Kuroko seemed to be experimenting with something new. He was seen dribbling the ball more frequently. Tsuna observed this with a shake of his head, choosing not to comment. Midorima, who had known Kuroko longer than Tsuna, couldn't help but be skeptical about the change. However, he also realized that if Kuroko managed to incorporate this into his game, it could become a formidable weapon. The practice games between Shotoku and Seirin throughout the week concluded as anticipated, with Shotoku emerging victoriously in all of them. Seirin began packing their equipment and preparing to depart as it was time for them to return to Tokyo. "I believe they were just lucky when they beat us last time." Takao expressed his opinion. This comment earned him a light reprimand from Miyagi, who smacked the back of his head. Atsubo shook his head and offered a correction, saying, "You're mistaken. They're undeniably improving. You must have noticed it when you faced them directly." While Seirin hadn't secured a victory against Shotoku in their recent games, the point difference on the scoreboard was not as overwhelming as Fukuda Soo's lead against Seirin. Furthermore, they had abstained from using Kagami, who was engaged in his own specialized training. Atsubo observed Kiyoshi, who was bidding them farewell with a wave. He added, "And with Kiyoshi back, they've finally regained their full strength." Takao, a bit perplexed, scratched his head in response. Takao noticed that Midorima was missing and inquired, "Has anyone seen Shin?" "He probably went ahead to watch the game by himself." Miyagi shook his head, contemplating a scolding for Midorima's lack of communication. Takao sighed and suggested, "Well, we're all heading to the game anyway. Let's meet up with Shin in the stadium." Seirin's team made their way to a bus station after their practice games. Kagane sighed as they walked, saying, "Man, I'm beaten. I felt like I was gonna collapse," someone added. "Agreed. I can't get a good night's sleep without my own pillow. I'm the same. Can't sleep in someone else's bed. I miss my own." The first-year players shared these sentiments with Kagane. "Stop complaining, you dimwits." Haiga, their captain, had enough of the complaints, and an awkward silence settled over the group. Haiga sighed at this. The grueling training had taken its toll, and he felt the same exhaustion as his teammates. Kiyoshi, on the other hand, chuckled. "Hey, guys, chin up. Look at how Fukuda Soo trains. And that's just their regular routine to stay in perfect shape before their tournament." Hearing this, the Seirin players began to visualize themselves enduring Fukuda Sogo's daily training regimen. The first-year players shuddered as they exchanged nervous glances. "I'd be a goner for sure. Totally. I think I'd prefer dying, honestly." Aida, who had seen her fair share of athletes during her travels with her father, was equally awed by the remarkable physical condition of Fukuda Sogo's players. She had heard they were once delinquents, but their condition was truly impressive. Aida's gaze was unique, allowing her to see numerical representations of each player's physical abilities. Every number she saw was truly remarkable. Agiwara, Hizaki, and Nijimura, in particular, stood out. She couldn't begin to imagine the immense effort they'd invested to achieve these numbers. But then, a shiver ran down Aida's spine as she remembered her futile attempt to discern Tsuna's physical level. As Aida concentrated on Tsuna, he appeared to possess a sort of sixth sense, detecting her scrutiny. Their eyes met, and the chill that ran down her spine from the coldness in his gaze discouraged her from ever trying to gauge Tsuna's physical level again. Nevertheless, she couldn't help but assume that Tsuna's physical level definitely surpassed Agiwara, Hizaki, and Nijimura, a truly intimidating thought. Kagami, who was most eager to learn about Tsuna, couldn't resist asking, "Hey, what about that Kazama guy? I really wanted to face off against him, but..." Kagami looked towards Aida, displaying a hint of disappointment. Without hesitation, Hyuga promptly smacked Kagami on the head. Startled, Kagami inquired, "Why'd you do that?" Hyuga adjusted his glasses and explained, "Don't be ungrateful. You've improved significantly with her training regimen, haven't you?" Kagami sighed in response. He recognized the value of Aida's training but couldn't help feeling frustrated about missing an opportunity to compete against someone he'd known since his time in the United States. Kagami brimmed with confidence, believing that his addition to the team would prevent complete losses against both Fukuda Sogo and Shotoku. He thought they could at least secure 1 or 2 wins with him on the court. Kyoji offered a reassuring pat on Kagami's back and chuckled, "Haha, that guy is quite the monster. Don't let it bother you." Kagami rolled his eyes at Kyoji's comment. "If anything, it just makes me want to play against him even more," he grumbled. Kagami, with a sudden realization, turned to Kuroko, his curiosity piqued. "Hold on, Kuroko. You and Midorima knew this guy? How did you guys meet him?" To Kagami's knowledge, Tsuna was just like him, a Japanese native who had grown up in the United States. Kuroko contemplated momentarily before saying, "He was also a student at Tiako." This revelation left everyone baffled. The story seemed a little more complicated than they initially thought, and Izuki said, "I thought he was from the US, like Kagami. Something doesn't add up." Kuroko continued, "He had to return to the US due to a certain incident." Kagane, his curiosity piqued, tilted his head and asked, "What kind of incident was it?" But Hyuga intervened, smacking Kagane on the head and declaring, "That's not the key point here. How skilled was he compared to the generation of miracles?" Kyoji finally asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Kuroko came to a stop upon hearing Kyoji's question. He details how Tiako's basketball club worked, mentioning how they held tryouts to decide on placements during their first year. And 5 players were selected for the first string team. 4 of them became known as the Generation of Miracles. What wasn't widely known is that Kazama was initially one of these 5 players. Aida digested this revelation before pondering, "So, the rumors about him being on par with the Generation of Miracles are true." Kuroko shook his head and explained, "The outcome of our recent practice game should provide all the answers you need." The Seirin team fell into contemplative silence after Kuroko's statement. "That's right." Izuki nodded. He touched his chin and pondered aloud, "Still, it's really surprising that Shotoku couldn't even beat Fukuda Sogo." Seirin's players remained quiet, reflecting on this. Fukuda Sogo had consistently defeated Seirin in their practice matches and proved themselves superior to Shotoku in every game. Even Midorima couldn't pull off a win. Kagami's surprise was evident in his voice. Aida sighed as she broke it down, "They've figured out how to shut down Midorima's shots. While it's a relatively new strategy and not entirely flawless, it was still effective in preventing Midorima from scoring. This gave Fukuda Sogo a substantial lead." Hearing this explanation, Kuroko fell silent. Aida referred to a combination of Agiwara and Fukuda Sogo's shooting guard, Mochizuki. Since their last encounter, Kuroko had noticed that Agiwara had made significant improvements and clenched his fist in response. He remembered his promise to Agiwara during their time at the resort, swearing to perfect his new technique before the Winter Cup so he could proudly face his childhood friend as a worthy opponent. Ugh! I want to face them so bad! Kagami exclaimed in frustration as he held his head, absorbing all this information. As Seirin kept talking about the training and even mentioning their upcoming ones, Aida suddenly walked in the opposite direction as she spoke. Where are you guys going? To the station, of course. Hyuga tilted his head in confusion. Aida sighed as she mentioned, why do you think we held our summer camp here? This year's tournament is held here. Oh, that's right. Izuki said as he opened up his phone. Everyone also turned to Izuki as he slowly spoke. Today's matches are between Tou Academy vs. Kaijo High. Chapter 82, Chapter 80, A Refined Desire for Her. In a massive, vibrant stadium, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement, teeming with fans eagerly awaiting the basketball showdown between two renowned members of the Generation of Miracles. The stadium's towering bleachers were a sea of colorful team banners, echoing with the joyful chatter of the crowd. As the anticipation hung heavy in the air, you could feel the spectators' energy, eager to witness this epic clash of basketball titans. Whoa, who do you think will win? It's hard to choose. Both of them were so good. Whispers and hushed conversations rippled through the stadium, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Spectators were divided in their opinions, debating fiercely over who would emerge victorious in the impending showdown. I hope Kai's won this, he's my idol. Some placed their faith in Kai's, considering him their idol and hoping for his triumph. Ha! Of course, Aomine would win this. He's the ace of the Generation of Miracles. The fervor for the upcoming showdown between Kai's and Aomine was undeniable, the crowd hanging on every word and movement of these renowned basketball figures. Their legendary status had etched them into the annals of Japanese basketball history. On the other hand, the excitement for the match between Fukuda Soo Academy and Onidai High was notably subdued compared to the clash between Tou Academy and Kaijo High. Fukuda Soo's meteoric rise to power was still relatively fresh, while the Generation of Miracles had long been a household name in Japan's basketball landscape. The contrast in anticipation was evident in the buzzing chatter of the spectators. Meanwhile, in one of Kaijo's designated changing rooms, the atmosphere was chaotic. A teenager with short, spiky black hair, intense steel blue eyes, and thick eyebrows hurled a basketball at Kai's. Kai's had been seeking permission from his fans to grab a quick bite. Captain, can't you cut me some slack? Kai's grumbled. The ball launcher was none other than Yukio Kasumatsu, the captain of Kaijo High. But before Kasumatsu could reprimand Kai's, a teenager with short black hair with a slight green tint, parted to the right, Yoshitaka Moriyama, kept whispering about some cute girls who might be watching their game today. This visibly annoyed Kasumatsu. To add to the chaos, another teen with short, spiky light brown hair, big eyebrows and an incessant loudmouth kept hollering about giving his all in the upcoming game. This pushed Kasumatsu over the edge, and he clutched his head in frustration, shouting, "For heaven's sake, just shut up! You're all driving me insane!" The door swung open, and a chubby middle-aged man in a suit stormed in, his brows furrowed. "What's all this commotion? We've got a big game today. Focus, people!" Kazumatsu's eyes widened as he took in their coach, Genta Takuchi, looking rather overdressed in his suit. In a dry tone, Kasumatsu muttered, "Why are you wearing a suit, coach?" Trying to rival that dashing coach from Tou Academy. This earned a round of suppressed laughter from the room as they tried not to mock their coach's unconventional outfit choice. Meanwhile, in one of the stadium's corridors, a pink-haired teenager appeared visibly agitated. Her cheeks were puffed up in a cute, displeased expression as she hurried along. In her haste, she accidentally bumped into someone. Quickly, she bowed and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry, I should have been more careful with my steps." "Ah." The person she collided with gently inquired, "It's okay. You seem to be in a hurry. What's going on?" Suddenly, her eyes widened as she spotted a face she recognized, a mix of familiarity and surprise washing over her. Without hesitation, she rushed forward, eager to embrace the person. "Tsuna." She held him tightly, and Tsuna responded with a gentle smile, saying, "It's been a while, Satsuki." His warmth brought a smile back to her face, and curious Tsuna asked, "So, what makes you be in such a hurry?" However, as if remembering something unpleasant, the cheer slowly faded from Momoi's expression. She began venting her frustration about Aomine running late once again. They found a bench and sat down. Tsuna couldn't help but ask a few questions. He wondered if Aomine knew he had returned to Japan and was lounging around. Was he really that arrogant now? As Momoi explained, she had made several attempts to inform Aomine. Still, he consistently cut her off, thinking she was about to give him a good scolding because she found out about Aomine's new collections. After a few failed attempts, she grew frustrated and gave up trying to tell Aomine about Tsuna's return. Tsuna responded with a comforting smile, trying to ease Momoi's frustration. Still, it seems like Aomine believes the only one who can beat him is himself. Hey! Tsuna grinned, remarking, seems like he's become too full of himself. Momoi's expression turned somber, her eyes welling up with tears. Aomine, who used to be the liveliest among their friends, had drastically changed. Listening to her account of events, Tsuna gently shook his head and comforted her, reassuring her not to be too concerned. Don't fret. I'll knock some sense into him and set things right. Momoi, tears wiped away, managed a weak smile and nodded at Tsuna. Tsuna's expression, changing into a sly grin, added, Why? Are you doubting me? Haven't you got all my stats by now? A playful glint filled Tsuna's eyes as he playfully teased her. When Momoi heard Tsuna mention the data, a hint of intrigue flashed in her eyes as she squinted slightly. She maintained a professional smile as she spoke, Your data is indeed impressive. But, remember, our team is incredibly strong too. We've got all your team's data. Winning won't be a walk in the park for you, Tsuna. Her eyes opened slightly, but instead of her typical affectionate gaze, they had taken on a cold and calculating edge this time. Upon hearing this, Tsuna's smirk grew even wider, revealing his intense desire. I want her. Tsuna thought as he looked at Momoi. He coveted her talent. Satsuki Momoi possessed an extraordinary ability to gather data with frightening precision, complete with potential counters for her opponents. Furthermore, Tsuna had heard that she could predict players' future growth. It was a talent he yearned for in his pursuit to become the best in the world of basketball. Pushing that thought aside, Tsuna's smile returned to its gentle nature as he rose to his feet. Well, Aomine must find it quite enticing to play against Kai's. He shouldn't be late this time, he remarked, oozing confidence. I'll be waiting for you in the semifinals. Satsuki Momoi arched an eyebrow, her smile growing. Confident, aren't you? The game hasn't even started. Tsuna merely shook his head. They're not bad, but at the same time, they're not that exceptional either. Though it might sound a tad overconfident, Tsuna had gathered enough information about their opponents. While his data wasn't as comprehensive as Momoi's, it gave him a solid game plan. Momoi smiled, thinking, he's still the same, isn't he? If it was him, it might be possible. Momoi murmured as she pondered about Aomine while watching Tsuna's departing figure. With a wave and a parting remark, Tsuna headed off, and Momoi also returned to her duties as Tou Academy's manager, leaving the corridor to rejoin her team. Chapter 83, Chapter 81, Tou Academy vs Kaijo High. As Momoi returned to their assigned changing room, she found Aomine already there. She scolded him for causing her concern, but he simply chuckled, mentioning that Kai's could be entertaining to play against, so he didn't want to be late. The coach of Tou Academy let out a sigh of relief. With Aomine on their side, they felt confident about securing a victory. He urged them to prepare as he said, All right, let's get ready. The game is starting soon, and we can't afford to be late to the court. Motivated by their coach's words, the members of Tou Academy nodded and started making their way to the court, ready to face their opponents. As both teams arrived at the court, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd erupted with enthusiastic shouts and deafening screams. Their excitement was palpable, and the fervor was almost tangible as they eagerly anticipated the match. The spectators couldn't contain their enthusiasm, and the air was charged with the energy of their anticipation. Wow, a match between two generation of miracles! Kaijo said, his gaze scanning the stadium enthusiastically. The crowd's really pumped. Kagane agreed with a nod as he looked around. Seirin was hunting for available seats, and Kagane's eyes widened as he pointed out, Hold on, isn't that Fukuda Soo over there? The rest of the team turned their attention to where Kaijo was gesturing, spotting Tsuna and his crew nearby. Looking at Kaijo's excited expression, Hyuga adjusted his glasses, clearly skeptical. He began, You can't be suggesting we sit with. Let's go sit with them. I'm sure there are plenty of seats. But before he could finish, Kaijo intervened with a broad smile, interrupting protests. Without waiting for others to chime in, he strode to Tsuna's group and greeted them, "Hey there! I thought you guys had a game today. Why are you guys still here?" This sudden arrival drew the attention of everyone from Fukuda Soo to Kiyoshi. Observing Kiyoshi's friendly approach, Hyuga sighed resignedly before joining him. Kagami and Kuroko shared a look and, with a shrug, followed suit. The remaining Seirin team couldn't object, so they joined Kiyoshi. Meanwhile, Nijimura gazed back at the courts where Kaijo and Tou finally started the game. He responded, "We're up next after these folks." Izuki, curious about the situation, pointed to the adjacent court and asked, "Why aren't both games happening simultaneously?" Nijimura, equally puzzled, looked at Tsuna for an answer. However, Tsuna did not seem to want to answer. Nijimura could only scratch his head and responded, "I'm not entirely sure about the details, but perhaps your coach has more information on this." Aida pondered momentarily, her hand gently supporting her chin as she replied, "Well, I'm not entirely sure if my guess is spot on. But it seems like the committee aims to showcase both matches equally. If they ran both games simultaneously, fans might get too engrossed in the Generation of Miracles showdown and overlook the other match." Glancing over at Tsuna, who appeared quite laid back while watching the game, Aida elaborated, "So, they wanted the audience to split their focus evenly, especially with Fukuda Soo's newfound recognition. The story of an underdog rising to glory has always been a beloved tale for people of all ages. It's a narrative that resonates deep within us because it encapsulates the human spirit's triumph over adversity. The audience revels in watching a determined individual or team overcome the odds and achieve greatness, making it a story worth cherishing." In addition to the emotional connection, this fascination has a practical aspect. Those involved in the entertainment and media industry recognize that these stories are not only heartwarming but also lucrative. Such stories can capture the public's attention, draw more viewers, and ultimately increase profits. This dual significance, blending the emotional and the practical, makes underdog tales a cherished commodity in the world of entertainment. Kagami, puzzled by the complex discussions, chose to ignore it. He scratched his head as he turned to Kuroko for some clarity. He asked, "Kuroko, who do you think will win?" Kuroko remained silent as his attention was fixed on the ongoing match. As the first quarter ended, Kai's and his team at Kaijo managed to keep Aomine and Tou Academy in check, leading to an unexpected advantage for Kaijo. The turn of events surprised the spectators. Even after witnessing the intense match, Kuroko was uncertain about the outcome. He confessed, "I'm not sure. This is the first time I've seen two Generation of Miracles competing in an official game." However, he drew from their past at Tiako to provide some insight. "Back during our days at Tiako, Kai's never managed to win a single one-on-one against Aomine," Kuroko revealed. This revelation left the Seirin players in contemplative silence. Following that, Kuroko shifted his gaze to Tsuna, fully aware of Aomine's history of engaging in one-on-one duels with him. Kiyoshi suddenly inquired, "Hey, Kazama. Who do you think will come out on top in this matchup?" Tsuna glanced at Kiyoshi briefly before returning to the game as the second quarter had begun. As the game played out, Tsuna shared his thoughts, saying, "Kai's doesn't stand a chance unless he's overcome his limitations and can mimic Aomine's moves." Kagami appeared surprised and asked, "Really? Kai's is strong, though. Can he even copy Aomine's moves?" Meanwhile, Hyuga stood to the side, wearing a scornful expression. "Ha! It's just not possible," he muttered under his breath, his gaze locked on Kai's, who was giving his all on the court. He couldn't help but feel annoyed, remembering how Akashi had shattered his pride, thanks partly to Kai's appearance. Trying to mimic that guy's moves is like asking for trouble. Tsuna observed Hyuga's biased opinion but kept his thoughts to himself. He knew that Hyuga was the sort of person who only changed his mind when confronted with undeniable evidence. And it wasn't like Hyuga's point of view was completely unfounded. Observing how Aomine managed to swing the game back into Tou Academy's favor, Tsuna explained, "Well, it's theoretically possible, but imitating Aomine's style puts immense strain on your body, especially if you are not accustomed to it." On the court, Kai's found himself defending against Aomine, who wore a cocky smirk as he taunted Kai's captain, "Look at that, quite the dependable senior you have there." Kai's face tensed up at Aomine's comment, and the latter persisted with his taunting. "If you can't take me on alone, you're relying on your team, huh? You're getting more like Tetsu, Kai's." Aomine maintained his dribble, evading Kai's defense while needling him, to which Kai's retorted, "Well, I can appreciate Kuroko's mindset, I guess." Aomine attempted to keep Kai's under pressure, but Kai's surprised him by closing off all openings. With determination in his eyes, Kai's inched closer, intensifying the pressure on Aomine, and boldly declared, "I don't care. My only goal is to defeat you." Aomine's smirk grew even wider in response. "Ha, you're a real comedian." Chapter 84, Chapter 82, Greeting an Old Friend. The pressure was intense. Izuki exclaimed. Aomine had completely shifted the momentum in Tou's favor during the second quarter. As the clock wound down, Kai's realized that he couldn't truly compete with Aomine when he held such deep admiration for his skills, especially after Aomine broke through their defense again and racked up more points. "Then, I just need to stop admiring him," Kai's mumbled, his expression and focus altering as he made up his mind. After the first half, both teams made their way back to their changing rooms. Kuroko appeared deep in thought and exchanged a few words before leaving his seat. Tsuna sensed that Kuroko might want to talk to Kai's. As the break ended, the crowd's buzzing sounds filled the arena once more. Both teams took to the court, ready to continue the intense match. The third quarter commenced with Sakurai, Tou's shooting guard, possessing the ball. Moriyama and Kasumatsu put on the pressure, with Kasumatsu making a skillful steal and passing the ball to Kai's. Imiyoshi tried to stop Kai's in his tracks. But something peculiar happened. Kai's appeared to be in a trance, murmuring something under his breath. He then pulled off a move that stunned everyone in the audience. Kai's flawlessly executed a crossover move that mirrored Aomine's style, forcing Imiyoshi to foul him in an attempt to stop his advance. The crowd erupted into cheers as Kai's pulled off that stunning crossover move. It was a moment that had everyone on their feet. Izaki, on the other hand, couldn't believe his eyes. He stood up from his seat, his disbelief plain to see. Tsuna calmly watched Izaki's reaction, curious about how he would respond. But to his surprise, Izaki abruptly left his seat, choosing not to watch the game further. Tsuna couldn't help but shake his head in disappointment. "It seems it wasn't the right moment," Tsuna mumbled, refocusing his attention on the intense game on the court. Kai's kept up his dribble, smoothly sidestepping Wakamatsu's defense, and then performed a stunning formless shot. It drew yet another foul, this time from Wakamatsu. Kai's confidently sank both of the free throws. Aomine observed everything in silence. The Kaijo team's spirit was soaring, and the crowd was electrified by Kai's impressive imitation of Aomine's moves. Kaijo was making a strong comeback, slowly narrowing the score gap. The excited crowd roared, celebrating Kaijo's retaliation. The atmosphere was electric as they cheered for the thrilling turnaround. Yet Aomine was not about to be outshone. He took possession of the ball and countered with his version of the formless shot, effortlessly sinking the basket. A hush fell over the crowd as they marveled at the sudden and skillful move. Every single member of Kaijo stared at Aomine in utter disbelief. It was as if Aomine was sending a clear message never to underestimate his prowess. "That was a shot. Unbelievable, no way. Whoa." The crowd burst into euphoric cheers, reveling in the incredible display of skill. It felt like Kaijo was making a comeback, igniting a newfound sense of hope among the spectators. But Aomine wasn't one to back down easily. The atmosphere crackled with tension as everyone awaited the next thrilling move in this intense match. Kai's reacted the same way as his teammate. He looked at Aomine, who turned to him. "I don't have all day. Can't wait for you to get it together," Aomine said with a chilly tone as he returned to his spot on the court. Kai's fell into silence, watching Aomine's retreating figure. Before he could react, a sudden smack on the back of his head made him flinch. He turned to Kasumatsu, irritated as he demanded, "What's that for?" "You're overthinking, you blockhead," Kasumatsu sternly said and pointed to the whole team. "You really think we're that weak? Just do your part." Kai's teammates smiled supportively, encouraging him to believe in their combined strength. Kai's heart swirled with complex emotions. His chest felt heavy, and he pondered if this was akin to what Kuroko often experienced. "This is a weird sensation," Kai's whispered to himself as the game raged on. Receiving the ball again, he flashed a small smile and continued, "But I don't hate this feeling." Observing Kai's smile, Kuroko somehow grasped the depth of his feelings and smiled along. In a pivotal moment, Kai's determination crystallized. With unwavering focus, Kai's faced off against Aomine once more. Aomine seemed to realize that Kai's gaze was different this time. But he just scoffed as he didn't think there would be any changes. However, Kai's executed a flawless drive, seamlessly integrating his own style with Aomine's moves. This made him lose his focus as he watched it in disbelief. Because of this, Aomine fouled him in his attempt on trying to stop Kai's. But Kai's, with incredible finesse, tossed the ball behind his back and made the shot. That was Aomine's move. Imyoji widened his eyes in disbelief. Imyoji clenched his teeth when he realized Aomine had acquired his fourth foul. One more and Aomine would be disqualified. This meant trouble for Aomine and Tou Academy as a whole. Aomine exchanged incredulous glances with Kai's. However, Kai's expression held a hint of condescension as he gazed upon Aomine. A prick to Aomine's pride. Kai's proceeded to make both free throws with precision. With the ball in Imyoji's hands, he attempted to set Aomine up for a play. But Aomine's focus seemed to waver, leading to an uncharacteristic fumble and enabling Kai's to snatch the ball away. Sakurai made an attempt to step in, but he found himself trailing in Kai's wake, closely shadowing Aomine's speed. As Kai's executed these moves, Aomine's demeanor turned icy. He scoffed, "Ha, daring to look at me like that." Aomine rapidly shifted to intercept Kai's. With Kai's targeting a dunk, Aomine expertly swatted the ball away with a lightning-fast reflex. Aomine seemed to apply no restraint to his block, sending the ball hurtling into the stands. Coincidentally, it sailed toward Tsuna, who smoothly caught it. "Oh, you're here. Tsuna, they told us to come down and get ready." Suddenly, a voice resonated through the audience, breaking the tension. Kagami's ears perked up, recognizing the familiar voice, and he couldn't believe his eyes as he turned his head. His mouth hung open in disbelief as he looked at the figure who had just spoken. The figure spotted Kagami in the crowd and waved friendly, saying, "Oh, Taiga, you're here too." Kagami, still in a state of shock, stood there speechless and unable to respond. Tsuna motioned for his team to head out while he strolled to the court's edge, a basketball balanced on his head. He called back to the figure, "Hold on a sec, Alex. I've got an old friend to say hi to." The figure, now recognized as Alexandra, looked at him puzzled. "Hey? What do you mean?" But Tsuna remained silent. With a graceful movement, he sent the basketball hurtling through the air. The ball cut through space with a swift whoosh, powered by Tsuna's incredible strength. Aomine instinctively turned his gaze towards the stands, feeling an unexpected shift in the atmosphere. He locked eyes with an incoming basketball, hurtling straight toward him. Caught off guard, Aomine attempted to catch the ball, but it slipped through his fingers and tumbled across the court. "Hey! That was pretty dangerous." He began to scold the unidentified person who had thrown the ball, but his words got lodged in his throat as he witnessed a familiar figure he hadn't seen in several years. Seeing Aomine's shocked gaze, Tsuna just smirked in return. Chapter 85, Chapter 83, the team will face next. Aomine's eyes widened with disbelief as he spotted Tsuna among the spectators. The sight seemed almost surreal. "You?" Aomine stammered, struggling to process the unexpected sight. He shook his head, attempting to clear the shock that clouded his thoughts. Then he asked, "When did you come back to Japan?" But Aomine's words couldn't reach Tsuna, who stood far away in the audience. Even though Tsuna couldn't hear Aomine's words, he could make a good guess from Aomine's mouth movements. As he turned his body, a small smile formed on his face, and the bold white letters on his jacket became visible. Fukuda Soo Academy. Aomine mumbled to himself. His lips curled into a smirk. Then, he shifted his attention to Kai's and spoke up, "Let's finish this fast. I've got a more interesting opponent in mind." Kai's furrowed his brow as he watched Tsuna leave. Aomine's enthusiasm for facing Tsuna was more than playing against him, leaving Kai's both frustrated and intrigued. Thinking back to their previous meeting, Kai's wondered aloud, "Who is that guy?" The rest of the players from both Kaijo and Tou couldn't get a clear look at Tsuna, but they did notice the jersey he was wearing. Imyoji pondered aloud, "Fukuda Soo? Weren't they up against Onidai today?" Somehow, that figure he saw in the Fukuda Soo jersey triggered an eerie sense of familiarity, like a déjà vu that sent shivers down his spine. Shaking his head to dispel the unsettling feeling, Imyoji refocused on their own match. In the spectator stands, Kagami pointed at Alexandra's smiling face with disbelief. "How did you end up here?" Kagami seems to recognize that beautiful foreigner. I think she greeted him earlier, right? Yet. The other members of Seirin were taken aback by this revelation. Alexandra chuckled and explained, haha, Tsuna helped me find a job in Japan. Kagami turned to Tsuna as Alexandra mentioned this. However, Tsuna had already moved forward with his teammates because they had a game to attend. Alex, if you want to catch up with Taiga, go ahead, Tsuna said. Is that okay? I'm your team's coach, you know. Alexandra thought coaches should stay with their team during an official game, so she was also about to leave with them. Glancing at Kagami, who appeared full of questions, Tsuna smiled and shook his head. Don't worry about it. Besides, this match should be a piece of cake for us, Tsuna casually added as they walked away and headed to their designated changing room. Alexandra shook her head in amusement as she remained behind. Seirin players who heard all this were perplexed because they were conversing in English. However, proficient in English, Kagami understood the conversation and gazed at Alexandra with surprise. Aida and Kiyoshi, with some understanding of English, also picked up on the fact that Alexandra was the coach of Fukuda Soo. Alex, did you come to Japan because of this? Kagami asked, puzzled. Haha, don't worry about it, Alexandra casually said, approaching Kagami and enveloping him in a warm hug. She appeared genuinely delighted to reunite with her student in Japan. But speaking of which, how's life in Japan? Hold on, Aida abruptly interjected, her gaze fixed firmly on Kagami, attempting to extricate himself from Alexandra's embrace. She inquired, if she was Fukuda Soo's coach, how did you two already know each other? Hearing this, everyone from Seirin shifted their attention to Kagami, who had just managed to extricate himself from Alexandra's hug. Kagami scratched his head, a sheepish grin on his face, and explained, that. She's my teacher from back in the States. He grabbed Alexandra just in time to prevent her from pouncing on Aida and mumbled, she still has this strange habit, I see. What did you say? Aida couldn't contain her surprise and blurted it out. Her outburst drew annoyed glances from the people around them, and the Seirin players bowed apologetically. Yet, their astonishment at the revelation about Alexandra remained evident in their expressions. The third quarter ended on the court, with Tou Academy holding the lead. Players from both teams sat on their respective benches to catch their breath. Amid this intermission, a voice over the loudspeakers announced the arrival of Fukuda Soo Academy and Onidai onto the court for their upcoming game. Aomine's attention was immediately drawn to Fukuda Soo Academy. His eyes lit up with excitement as he spotted Tsuna stepping onto the court, proudly sporting his number 4 jersey and leading the team as their captain. Aomine's eyes wandered across the court, and he couldn't help but be taken aback by the sight of Nijimura and Hizaki on the same team. However, his attention swiftly returned to Tsuna, and he became strangely fixated. In a hushed tone, he muttered, I want to face him. Aomine's words carried across the team bench, and his teammates turned to him with expressions of shock as if they had witnessed a rare and extraordinary event. Momoi, who had known Aomine for a long time, recognized a feeling she hadn't seen in him for a while, an eagerness to challenge a formidable opponent. Is this for real? Pinch me, someone, Wakamatsu exclaimed, almost in disbelief, as he lightly slapped his own face. This can't be happening. His teammates exchanged baffled glances. They were equally convinced they were wide awake, not lost in some dream. Imiyoshi furrowed his brows, eyes narrowing as he followed Aomine's intense gaze. He spotted a figure who felt all too familiar there, a player he had crossed paths with a few years back. An involuntary shiver coursed through him as he observed the newcomer's nonchalant expression, seemingly bored with the whole affair. Memories of the restroom incident involving Tsuna and Hanamiya flooded Imiyoshi's mind. It was an unforgettable incident. Momoi, keenly observant, noted the flicker of recognition in Imiyoshi's eyes. She leaned in closer, her curiosity piqued. Captain, do you know Tsuna? She asked, drawing the entire team's attention. They eagerly awaited Imiyoshi's response. Imiyoshi nodded, his gaze clouded by the memories of a game that took place 3 years ago. It was a match where they had faced Tsuna back when Imiyoshi was playing for Hibiya Junior High. The recollection of their painful loss still stung. Their coach, Harasawa, turned his attention to Momoi, his curiosity piqued. He glanced at Aomine before inquiring, do both of you know this young captain quite well? The question hung in the air, prompting more details about their connection to Tsuna. He used to be part of our team in Teiko, but he had to leave for personal reasons, Momoi explained. She then pulled up a folder containing information about Fukuda Soo. And if we win against Kaijo, his team is our next opponent. Sakurai looked confused. But their game hasn't even happened yet. How do you know they're our next opponents? Momoi shook her head and focused on the data about Fukuda Soo. It's just that I find it highly unlikely for Onidai to win against them, she stated, her confidence in their upcoming match evident. Tou Academy players were taken aback by this. Momoi's statement left them re-evaluating their expectations for the upcoming match. Harasawa furrowed his brow, acknowledging the terrifying reliability of Momoi's data. Her unmistakable confidence indicated a substantial difference in skill between these two teams. He shook his head and called for his team's attention, clapping his hands together. All right, enough distractions, he said firmly. We'll discuss the next opponent later. For now, let's refocus on our game. We must secure this victory before we even think about facing them. Chapter 86, Chapter 84, Lost in the Abyss. In the stands, Seirin exchanged glances as Hyuga adjusted his glasses. He pondered aloud, you think we should catch the next game, too? Their collective, intent gaze toward the adjacent court, where Fukuda Soo and Onidai were gearing up, offered a unanimous response. Hyuga couldn't help but shake his head slightly, sharing their curiosity about the upcoming game. The warm-up and opening ceremonies for both teams would take about half an hour, so everyone redirected their attention to the ongoing match between Kaijo and Tou. The fourth quarter commenced with Aomine swiftly taking control of the ball. He dribbled through Kaijo's defense with impressive finesse, flaunting his skills, and eventually unleashed a distinctive shot. Aomine was clearly fired up, driven by the anticipation of facing Tsuna's team in their next match. Kaijo's frustration was palpable, and even though the game drew close, they refused to give up, no matter how slim their chances seemed. Inspired by Aomine's display, Kaijo was determined to replicate his move, much like several others on the court. Despite pushing himself to the absolute limit, Kaijo took a challenging shot. His fatigued legs made it a struggle, but the ball rattled around the rim before finally dropping into the basket. Both teams showed visible signs of exhaustion, yet Kaijo's determination remained unwavering, fueled by Kaijo's relentless effort. Aomine, watching the tenacity in Kaijo's eyes, couldn't help but be reminded of Kuroko's own unwavering gaze. In the midst of the heated game, Tou made an attempt with their shooting guard, but a fumble led to a steal by Kaijo. Kaijo confronted Aomine, who was keenly focused on predicting his next action. With a rapid and crafty fake, Kaijo looked poised to execute a formless shot. He quickly passed the ball behind him to Kasumatsu, but Aomine's lightning-quick reflexes enabled him to deflect the pass. Seeing Kaijo's astonished face, Aomine shook his head rather disappointedly. You've copied my moves well, he admitted. But then, his expression turned cold, and he added, you made a critical error, though. I never pass the ball. Get up. You dimwit. Kasumatsu scolded, provided Kaijo with words of encouragement in his own way, and reminded him that the game was still far from its conclusion. The game pushed on, and the tension began to crumble as Kaijo initiated an attack. Moriyama went for a layup, but Aomine swooped in, snatching the ball and racing down the court, leaving Kaijo's defenders in his wake. He reached Kaijo's defense line in a heartbeat, soaring into the air. In a last-ditch effort to block a dunk, Kaijo leaped but came up short, crashing to the ground as the game came to a close with a score of 98-110. Kaijo couldn't pull it off either. Hey! Kagami muttered, concern in his eyes as he watched Kaijo struggle to rise after attempting to copy Aomine's technique. He really pushed himself, remarked another observer, noting the visible strain on Kaijo's body. Kuroko regarded the situation somberly, recognizing that imitating Aomine was taking a significant toll on Kaijo. He recalled the words Kazama had once said, wondering if he had foreseen this outcome. His gaze shifted to the upcoming match between Fukuda Soo and Onidai, leaving the current scene behind. Coach, do you think Onidai can hold their own against Fukuda Soo? Izuki inquired, his eyes fixed on the Fukuda Soo team. Aida pondered momentarily and replied, I can't say for sure, but Onidai is a formidable team. She gestured towards a player from Onidai with spiky dark brown hair, some strands covering his eyes. Take Keisuke Kobayashi, for example. He's a top-tier player, though he may not quite reach the level of the Generation of Miracles. He's been consistently drawing media attention with his exceptional performance. Aida nodded in agreement, then shifted her attention back to Tsuna, who calmly instructed his teammates. While Kobayashi is a formidable player, he might not be sufficient to contain that particular individual. Intrigued by the discussion, Kyoji turned to Alexandra, who was still accompanying them. Given that she was Fukuda Sogo's coach, she might have some valuable insights. He asked her in English, "Coach, what's your take on who will win this match?" Alexandra was taken aback by the sudden switch to English by Kyoji. She chuckled and said, "Oh, you can use Japanese. I speak Japanese, so feel free to use it, haha." She removed her glasses and observed Kobayashi, sensing a strong aura from him. Alexandra expressed her opinion, saying, "I agree with your lovely coach. He's quite skilled." However, her attention quickly shifted to Tsuna, and she felt an intense and unfathomable aura like a bottomless pit coming from him. And as the saying goes, when you stare into the abyss stares back at you. So, she hurriedly put her glasses back on and concluded, "But he's not good enough." Agreeing with one another, the Seirin team nodded in unison. They had witnessed Tsuna's incredible abilities, even though they hadn't seen the extent of his full power. They had tentatively placed him on the same level as the other members of the Generation of Miracles. The crowd's cheers interrupted their contemplation as the game between Fukuda Sogo and Onidai commenced. On the court, Fukuda Sogo took possession of the ball and swiftly passed it to Tsuna. With deft skill, Tsuna took control of the ball and cast a sidelong glance toward a particular individual. A confident smirk crept across his face as he signaled to his teammates to maintain their positions. Then, without hesitation, he bolted forward all on his own. "He's going solo. Talk about reckless. Whoa, that guy's fearless." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, electrified by Tsuna's audacious move. Simultaneously, Aomine grinned widely while observing Tsuna's bold move. Amongst the crowd, the onlookers from Tou wore expressions of intrigue, and even the departing Kaijo players couldn't resist a glance back at the court. Kai's, in particular, stared intently, his eyes fixed on Tsuna and his impending action. Kobayashi's face twisted with disapproval as he sensed an undercurrent of disrespect. He stepped up to Tsuna and voiced his displeasure, "You're quite the arrogant freshman, aren't you?" Amid it all, Tsuna remained unfazed, facing off with Kobayashi's defense. He executed a deft pivot to his right, catching Kobayashi off guard, and in a swift, unexpected shift, Tsuna crossed over to the opposite direction. It left Kobayashi visibly frustrated and surprised. This mesmerizing maneuver sent the crowd into a frenzy. Onlookers from other teams gaped in astonishment at Tsuna's agility and skill. Tsuna pressed on, displaying masterful ball-handling skills to maneuver past Kobayashi's defensive efforts. As he neared Onidai's basket, the stadium was hushed, and anticipation settled over the crowd. In a heart-stopping moment, Tsuna soared into the air, and a collective gasp seemed to escape the spectators. Every eye in the arena remained locked onto Tsuna. Time itself appeared to stand still, the atmosphere charged with electrifying tension. As Tsuna soared higher, the subtle rustling of clothing, the distant hum of the audience, and even the creaking of seats went unnoticed. All that mattered was this breathtaking moment. The world seemed to narrow down to this singular, suspended leap. With a thunderous slam, Tsuna executed a resounding dunk that sent shockwaves echoing through the stadium. It happened a split second after the game's commencement, catching everyone off guard. Stunned by the awe-inspiring leap, the once hushed crowd suddenly erupted into a frenzy of cheers. The sheer spectacle they had just witnessed ignited a wildfire of excitement that spread like wildfire across the stadium. Fans clapped, screamed, and jumped out of their seats, overwhelmed by the sheer brilliance of Tsuna's dunk. In the stands, various teams, including Seirin, Shotoku, Tou, and Kaijo, stared in open-mouthed astonishment. Aomine, who had been closely observing, couldn't contain his laughter. His joy was evident. He was thrilled that Tsuna's skills were as sharp as ever. He mumbled before leaving alongside his team, "Ah, finally. Can you push me to give it my all, Tsuna?" Chapter 87, Chapter 85, Resounding Triumph. As Tsuna returned to his position on the court, Nijimura couldn't help but shake his head, puzzled. "We've barely begun, and you're already so fired up. What's got you so excited?" Tsuna smirked, his eyes fixed on Tou's retreating team. "I need that guy to work himself to the limit for our match later. It wouldn't be any fun if he didn't." He turned to his own team, "All right, everyone, let's stick to our game plan from here on out." Everyone nodded in agreement, quickly assuming their respective positions, ready to continue the game. Tsuna's display of skill didn't faze Onidai. They continued the game and decided to double-team Tsuna to suppress him. However, their strategy had its downsides. Putting two players on Tsuna left their defense vulnerable. Haizaki and Agiwara, seizing the opportunity, exploited the gap in the defense. Nijimura couldn't help but grin in satisfaction. He mumbled, "Everything's going according to plan." Observing Haizaki and Agiwara, Nijimura noticed their eagerness to showcase their abilities. In the stands. Did he just copy their moves? Takao exclaimed, his eyes widening in surprise. He had no idea there was such a skilled player among Fukuda Sogo's team. On Seirin's side, Kagami appeared just as puzzled. "It's not the same." Kuroko shook his head and clarified. He explained, "Kai's copies his opponent's moves, mimicking their techniques. But Haizaki is different." Furihata, trying to understand, asked, "So, what's the difference?" Kuroko observed the game, his expression thoughtful, and replied, "Kai's imitates, but Haizaki snatches. It's not just mimicry, it's theft." With Kuroko's explanation, the others soon could see that Haizaki's technique from Onidai's player was no longer effective when its original owner attempted to use it. The game's rhythm was thrown into disarray. On the court, Nijimura knew the unique motivations driving both Haizaki and Agiwara. Haizaki drew inspiration from Kai's, who successfully mimicked Aomine's move, a feat Haizaki had never been able to do. On the other hand, Agiwara's motivation came from two of his closest friends, Kuroko, who observed from the stands, and Haizaki, who was eager to showcase his skills. These factors fueled Agiwara's determination to perform at his best. "Buddy, thanks to you, I can perform like this," Agiwara gratefully smiled at Haizaki. Haizaki scoffed and retorted, "Who the hell is your buddy?" Agiwara shook his head, amused by Haizaki's response. "He's still as shy as ever," Agiwara smiled as he glanced at the scoreboard. Nijimura refrained from commenting. At this point, he was more focused on the fact that they had taken over the game's momentum. In the first half, Onidai had given their all to penetrate Fukuda Sogo's defense. To their astonishment, Fukuda Sogo adeptly countered their attacking strategies. Onidai typically utilized a fast-paced attack, but both Nijimura and Agiwara demonstrated great skill in reading their patterns and successfully thwarted most of their attempts. Their attention turned to Mochizuki, who hadn't particularly stood out among the players. To their shock, Mochizuki was also not an easy opponent during his defense. Leaving them with no choice, they turned their attention to Tsuna. However, Onidai quickly realized they wouldn't have an easy time piercing the defense manned by Tsuna, a player whose imposing presence sent a shiver down their spines. Desperately seeking a way through and even resorting to 2 timeouts, every adjustment Onidai attempted was flawlessly countered. At the end of the first half, Fukuda Sogo chose to stay on the court instead of heading to their changing room. The audience found this surprising, but the other teams watching the game noticed that Fukuda Sogo's players didn't appear fatigued. Onidai also observed this, but they could only clench their teeth in frustration. While they, too, wanted to display their determination and pride, they realized the urgent need for a thorough strategy session to contend with these formidable opponents. "Ishida, get in there. Take Mochizuki's place. We're going to focus on scoring from up close," Tsuna directed, turning to Ishida, who had initially been their point guard before Tsuna took on the role. Ishida simply nodded in response. Mochizuki displayed no discontent with the decision. Through their extensive training together, they regarded Tsuna's commands as absolute within the team. The second half began shortly after the break, and Onidai gained possession of the ball. They intended to rely on their shooting guard and employ an outside attack strategy. However, they were taken aback when they noticed Mochizuki had been substituted. This didn't concern them much until they passed the ball to their shooter. As the shooter leaped for a shot, they suddenly realized that Ishida had swiped the ball, enabling Fukuda Sogo to seize control. Watching from the sideline, Mochizuki sported a sly grin. He recognized that, although he possessed the ability to thwart the shooter's attempts at scoring, he lacked the speed needed to steal the ball during the crucial moment when it was up for grabs before the shot. "Ah, that's why Ishida was subbed in. As expected, you shouldn't even question captain's decisions," Mochizuki thought to himself as Fukuda Sogo continued to dominate both offensively and defensively. The players from Onidai were growing increasingly frustrated. The score gap between the two teams was expanding, and they struggled to catch up. As the game approached its conclusion, a sense of defeat loomed over some of the Onidai players. They had lost hope of winning, fully aware that turning the tide was an impossible feat at this point. Observing Onidai's disheartened players, Tsuna couldn't hide his disgust. His gaze shifted to Kobayashi, who, despite the difficult situation, still had that fiery determination in his eyes. Tsuna admitted, "You're not bad." The unexpected compliment from Tsuna took aback Kobayashi. However, he quickly realized that Tsuna wasn't about to go easy on him. Tsuna swiftly weaved through Kobayashi's defense and added another point to Fukuda Soo's score just before the referee's whistle signaled the play's end. As the game concluded, Kobayashi turned to check the scoreboard, and a wave of frustration washed over him as he saw the score. An eerie silence fell upon the stadium as spectators fixated on the scoreboard. The other teams, who had been intently watching, were struck dumb, their mouths agape in disbelief. "Unbelievable," Kagami whispered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the scoreboard. Tsuna, the Fukuda Soo captain, addressed his team, "Great work today." The others smiled and exchanged nods. Suddenly, the stadium was engulfed in a deafening roar of celebration. The whole arena quivered with the vibrations of excitement, creating an electrifying atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. 112:34? Are you kidding me? The exclamation rippled through the crowd, disbelief etched on countless faces. Onidai simply was just a kid in front of them. Someone in the stands marveled. "So this is the dark horse of the tournament, hey?" A realization echoed through the spectators. "They're definitely worthy of the name." The cheers continued unabated, waves of admiration and respect for both teams, especially Fukuda Soo, who had left an indelible mark on the game. As the noise gradually waned, the players from both sides lined up again to exchange the customary post-game pleasantries. A red-haired teenager wore a smirk, a mischievous glint in his eyes, feeling the subtle gaze of one specific individual from Fukuda Soo. He mumbled to himself, "First, Aomine, now me. It seems like you're quite the social one." "Captain, it's time to head back," his team manager reminded. Acknowledging the manager with a nod, Akashi and the rest of his team turned and exited the crowd, leaving a buzzing audience behind. Chapter 88, Chapter 86, 0 wins. The crowd buzzed with anticipation for the next day's games, filled with excitement because they would feature two more members from the famed generation of miracles. Their expectations were high, and they couldn't wait to watch these upcoming matchups. Alexandra exchanged her farewells with Seirin, and they, too, began to leave the stadium. But a sense of unease was evident on every face as they walked together. Izuki's thoughts echoed their collective concern. "So, we're going up against these basketball prodigies again this winter." Kiyoshi, typically cheerful, wore a contemplative expression. The matches they had just seen were a powerful reminder of the need to become even stronger. Kagami's emotions were mixed. Thoughts of facing these formidable opponents stirred his excitement and determination. A confident smirk graced his face, he was eager to take them all on. But then, Kagami remembered that there were more Generation of Miracles members playing in the matches the next day. He couldn't help but ask, "Hey, can't we stick around to watch the matches tomorrow too? Don't you guys want to see them?" However, Kagami's suggestion earned him a strong grip from Hyuga, who shook Kagami's body with irritation. "You think we don't want to? But where's the money, hey? You think we're rich?" scolded Hyuga. Kagami could only helplessly nod as Hyuga continued, "And even if we could, our coach's dad would kill us if we stayed longer, you dumbhead." The rest of the Seirin team observed this quietly, their lips twitching as they felt rather speechless. After releasing Kagami, Hyuga turned to the others, his voice ringing, "Winter will be here soon. Let's get back and train harder." His shout attracted the attention of onlookers, but the Seirin players echoed their approval with a resounding yes. In a different section of the stadium, a tall teenager with green hair strolled casually along a corridor, sporting stylish black sunglasses. "Quite the games, hey, Shin." A voice suddenly broke his calm demeanor, and he turned to find someone leaning against the wall. Adjusting his glasses, the green-haired teenager responded, "How did you spot me, Takao?" "Anybody could spot you with that terrible disguise," Takao remarked with a helpless shake of his head. Midorima's brow furrowed at the personal affront. He shook his head and continued his stride, exiting the stadium. Takao matched Midorima's pace, walking beside him, and remarked, "Those guys are like real monsters, aren't they?" Midorima replied calmly, "Why? There's a monster right in front of you." Takao quickly looked at Midorima and quietly mused, "Well, you've got a point. We've got our own monster, too. Midorima gave a subtle smile in reply. Takao chuckled and mirrored the smile, saying, winter's gonna be interesting, isn't it? They strolled through the crowded corridor, where many people were conversing about the previous matches and eagerly discussing the upcoming games involving other members of the Generation of Miracles. And what caught them the most was, I'm itching to see Fukuda Soo Academy take on Tou Academy. Absolutely. I wish their game were tomorrow, too. Patience, folks. The best things come to those who wait. We'll get our showdown in 2 days. The crowd's conversation buzzed with anticipation for the upcoming semi-final clash between Fukuda Soo Academy and Tou Academy. The excitement was palpable, and they couldn't wait for the thrilling showdown. Walking along the bustling corridor, Seirin's members couldn't help but overhear the excited chatter about the upcoming semi-finals. Kazama against Aomine, hey. Hyuga pondered aloud. His teammates shared the same sentiment. Kagami, curious, turned to Kuroko for insights. Kuroko, you know both of them well, right? Who do you think will win? Kuroko's response was uncertain. To be honest, I'm not sure, he admitted with a slight shake of his head. As they watched the Generation of Miracles in action, Kuroko couldn't help but feel increasingly astonished by their abilities, even though he had been playing with them for 3 years. These guys were simply extraordinary. However, Kuroko's thoughts briefly turned to their shared past at Teako. He slowly spoke, if we look back on the past. Back then, Aomine and Kazama used to have one-on-one matches regularly. It happened so frequently that everyone at Teako would clear the court to watch them go head-to-head, Kuroko reminisced, recalling those distant memories. These revelations left the members of Seirin in a state of astonishment. Kagami shared in their amazement, commenting, so, it's similar to how Aomine and Kai's are, hey. Kuroko nodded in agreement and added, yes, that's right. Initially, Aomine was in a bad mood after Kazama left Japan. Nobody dared to challenge him to a one-on-one match, Kuroko explained, letting out a sigh. But Kai's arrival seemed to rekindle his enthusiasm a bit. Kuroko took a moment to collect his thoughts, searching for the best words to convey his point. He continued, but, it was different from Kazama. He paused again before stating, Kai's couldn't win a single game against Aomine. It didn't provide Aomine with the challenge he yearned for, ultimately leaving him longing for the excitement that defined his time with Kazama. Kuroko continued, this craving for stronger opponents drove Aomine to seek challenges repeatedly. It's also why Aomine began to feel bored and lose his passion. Kuroko explained that Tsuna's departure from Teako catalyzed Aomine's transformation. It ignited his desire for formidable adversaries. As his teammates listened intently, Kyoji inquired, so, did Kazama ever win a game against Aomine? Kuroko paused, his expression thoughtful, as he considered the question. Seirin's players grew anxious, and some swallowed nervously while waiting for Kuroko's response. After contemplating, Kuroko spoke, that's not quite right to put it that way. What do you mean? Did he lose to Aomine like Kai's did? Furihata, looking puzzled. Kuroko's frown deepened, and he shook his head. He met his teammate's eyes and began, actually, it's the opposite. Aomine had never won a single game ever. Time seemed to freeze as their eyes widened in utter disbelief. Their minds raced furiously, struggling to digest this seemingly ludicrous information. It was as if reality had taken an unexpected turn, leaving them baffled and shocked. How could that be? Aomine, the ace of the Generation of Miracles, couldn't even win a single one-on-one? Kagami, his eyes wide with incredulity. That's hard to believe. I do agree that it was indeed quite hard to believe. The others shared similar sentiments, racing to comprehend this unexpected twist. Kuroko gently refocused them, asserting, but it's the truth. Chapter 89, Chapter 87, Back on the Grind. After the game ended, Fukuda Soo headed back to the resort. When they arrived, they were pretty tired. They let out sighs of exhaustion as they climbed the stairs, eager to get back to their rooms and get some rest. However, just as they thought they could slip away, Nijimura's voice rang out, "Where do you guys think you're going?" Startled, they turned to him. As everyone's eyes focused on him, Nijimura motioned for them to turn their attention to Tsuna, who was strolling alone toward the gym. With a hint of disappointment, Nijimura sighed and said, "We still have training to do." One of the team members replied, "But we just won. Can't we take a break today?" Nijimura simply shook his head and hurried after Tsuna. Before leaving, he added, better be good and stick to the training. You wouldn't want our captain to oversee your practice personally, would you? When they heard this, everyone couldn't help but shuddered, remembering the days when they whined about training, and Tsuna had to step in. Even Haizaki showed a bit of discomfort at this. Realizing they had no choice, they grumbled loudly. But they followed Nijimura's lead and headed to the gym. The following day, Fukuda Soo stuck to Alexandra's training routine. However, given they had a game the day before, Alexandra decided to ease up a bit so they could recover and prepare to face Tou Academy the next day. Meanwhile, a group of teenagers engaged in spirited basketball practice in a sleek, modern gymnasium with polished wooden floors and towering glass windows that bathed the court in natural light. The gym was filled with the rhythmic bounce of basketballs and the sounds of people working hard on their drills. A teenager with spiky, light blonde hair gasped for breath, his frustration clear. That guy skipped practice again. He turned to someone nearby and asked, Captain Imiyoshi, should we go drag him to practice? Well, Wakamatsu, no need to go overboard, Imiyoshi said with a squint behind his glasses. Although he said that, frustration crept in as Imiyoshi pondered, we're up against another strong team this time. Aomine skipping practice could be a problem. Just then, a pink-haired teenager entered, holding some files in her hands. Ah, Momoi, thanks for your hard work, Imiyoshi said appreciatively, seeing that Momoi had brought the requested files. He signaled for his team to assemble. As the members of Tou Academy gathered, Momoi began distributing the files she'd prepared. Each player received a copy. These are the data I've gathered on our upcoming opponent, Fukuda Soo Academy. Momoi began explaining once everyone had the data in their hands. Momoi described the starting lineup of Fukuda Soo and highlighted specific players they needed to watch. She continued, the next key player is Shizo Nijimura. Nijimura used to be a power forward but switched to center in high school. His biggest assets are his incredible stamina and technique. He's also a former captain of Tiako Junior High. The team listened closely, clearly impressed. Momoi then provided an overview of Nijimura's playing style and his skills in the tournament. Next up, we have Shogo Haizaki, their power forward. Momoi then went on to describe Haizaki's unique talent for stealing opponents' moves, which was somewhat akin to Kaizo's but with its own nuances. This revelation prompted a serious reaction from everyone, leading to questions like, so, how can we deal with his ability? Momoi sported a slight grin as she detailed the inner workings of Haizaki's power and suggested potential strategies for countering it. The team members nodded attentively as they absorbed this information. Once Momoi wrapped up her discussion of Haizaki, her playful demeanor shifted to a stern one as she introduced the final player on their watch list. Now, let's talk about their current captain, who plays as a point guard, Tsunayoshi Kazama. No one had high expectations until they glanced at the data and realized that this player was, in fact, a freshman. Wait, he's a freshman? Questioned Sakurai, their shooting guard. This time, Imiyoshi sported a slight smile, unlike Momoi, and remarked, well, it's not really a shocker. Hey? Why is that? Wakamatsu asked, his head tilted in curiosity. Imiyoshi adjusted his glasses, his expression growing serious. He opened his eyes a tad wider and explained, I mentioned earlier that I faced him in a match 3 years ago. He had such complete control over his team that I mistook him as the actual captain. 3 years ago, he was still a freshman, right? Susa, too small forward, asked. Imiyoshi agreed with a nod and continued, and it was surprising for me to find that he wasn't the captain. So, when you said it wasn't surprising, you meant? Wakamatsu scratched his head and then clarified, he had the qualities of a captain even back then, so stepping into the role in high school makes sense, doesn't it? No, the story didn't end there, Imiyoshi said, shaking his head. Then, he did something unusual, fully opening his eyes, and added, I heard that after that game, Nijimura stepped down as captain and gave the position to Kazama. And it made him become the youngest captain in Tiako's history. The room went silent, and the revelation hung heavily in the air. Shocked expressions danced across their faces, their mouths agape, and their eyes stretched wide in a state of incredulity. Seeing their surprised expressions, Imiyoshi sighed and returned to his usual demeanor. He then turned to Momoi and said, I can't be entirely sure, as I couldn't confirm it myself, but Momoi might have more information. He asked her, so, Momoi, could you clarify this for us? Momoi gave a wry smile and shook her head, saying, "Our captain is right." Tsuna did become the captain during his freshman year. The team fell into silence once more. After this surprising revelation, the team began examining Tsuna's data carefully. They couldn't help but exclaim, "Wait a second. This guy is unbelievable. His stats are even better than Kai's Ryota from Kaijo." Miyoshi noticed this, too, and his expression grew serious as he turned to Momoi. "Momoi, can you persuade Aomine to attend practice this time? We're facing a tough opponent." Momoi smiled a little as she thought of Aomine and said, "Well, about that." Since Momoi and Aomine were neighbors, they crossed paths daily. Just yesterday, she spotted Aomine coming home, drenched in sweat and gripping a basketball. Recalling the joyous expression on Aomine's face, Momoi's smile widened as she added, "Aomine started training yesterday. I have a feeling he's still at it somewhere." This revelation triggered a much more intense reaction from the team than the news about Tsuna being a former Tiako Junior High captain. After all, from the beginning of their club activities, Aomine had never shown any inclination for training, whether with the team or on his own. So, it was hard to believe as Wakamatsu couldn't help but ask, "You're not joking, right?" Momoi, still with a smile, shook her head lightly. Miyoshi, although he was glad, he also realized another fact out of this. He squinted his eyes seriously, thinking, to make Aomine take him seriously, that means he's a real deal. Chapter 90, Chapter 88, Fukuda Soo Academy vs. Tou Academy. The big day had finally come. Today, in one of Kanagawa's largest stadiums, a massive crowd had packed into every available seat. The semi-finals of the Inter-High were about to kick off, and the stadium was electric with anticipation. The excited buzz of the crowd was unmistakable. Spectators chatted eagerly about the upcoming game between Fukuda Soo and Tou Academy, their voices filled with excitement and rising with anticipation. "Hey, SEI, it's not every day you invite us to watch a game together." A tall teenager in a white jacket with light blue accents and long black hair that reached his chin, with two strands covering his eyes, talked to a red-haired teenager who had just walked beside him. "Haha, Rio, I have a feeling Akashi's up to something," another teenager wearing a similar jacket with short blonde hair and dark oval-shaped eyes added. Akashi smiled as he remarked, "This game will be interesting, and I'd like all of you to watch. There are opponents in the final." While Akashi's words hinted at his confidence in their upcoming semi-final as if it was already in his grasp, Mibuchi and Kotaro didn't seem bothered as they also felt confident in winning their match later. "Well, if you say so, it's bound to be good," Mibuchi commented, sweeping his hair back behind his ears elegantly. He then turned to Kotaro and inquired, "Kotaro, where's Nebaya?" Kotaro scratched his head sheepishly as he explained, "Sorry, guys. I couldn't drag Nebaya away. He's still not done eating." Mibuchi facepalmed in response, shaking his head at Nebaya's never-ending appetite. "Don't sweat it," Akashi reassured them as they reached their seats. He added confidently, "I told him to come in person, so he'll be here." Mibuchi and Kotaro exchanged amused glances, trusting Nebaya would eventually show up. Nebaya wouldn't dare defy a direct order from Akashi. It was as good as a royal decree, and Nebaya understood that he had no choice but to comply. Failing to do so would likely lead to some unpleasant consequences. "Because I am absolute." Akashi's words hung in the air as he gazed down at the basketball court with a sense of unshakable confidence. "Hey, isn't that Akashi from Rakuzan?" "Hey? Where? Wow, you're right. Do you think we should ask for an autograph or something?" "I dunno, he looks pretty serious." The crowd quickly noticed Akashi's presence and began buzzing with excitement. Many of them wanted to approach him, but the intense aura he exuded made them think twice. Instead, they settled for watching him in admiration as they eagerly anticipated the game. In the designated changing room for Fukuda Soo, Nijimura looked puzzled. "Tsuna, are you sure we've got no game plan for this match?" Tsuna was known for his meticulous planning, so seeing him without a strategy was surprising this time. Nevertheless, Tsuna shook his head and addressed the team. "I don't think they'll have a solid plan either." Tsuna acknowledged that Momoi had probably devised counters for their techniques and abilities. It didn't worry him, though, as he had anticipated this. His eyes gleamed cunningly as he shared, "But I've got something in mind for the third quarter." Tsuna knew Aomine well enough to predict that he'd demand the ball from the very beginning. Planning for the early game was futile if it became a one-man show between them. Everyone shared meaningful looks as they leaned in to hear what Tsuna had to say. On the other side, tensions ran high inside Tou Academy's changing room. Wakamatsu grabbed Aomine by the collar. His voice raised in frustration. Do you fucking understand what you are saying? No one intervened as they, too, harbored dissatisfaction with Aomine's demands. Momoi watched with concern, glancing at their coach. He stepped in, attempting to cool things down. Okay, let's all take a breather. In Fukuda Sogo's changing room, heads were gently shaken as they attempted to regain their composure. Aomine, on the other hand, shot Wakamatsu a cold look. No need for violence, he remarked. And hands off. Wakamatsu's grip instinctively released, his eyes reflecting a mixture of frustration and unease. Aomine's cold gaze was undeniably intense, sending shivers down his spine. He had been a monster to me, but... Wakamatsu couldn't help but think that Aomine had transformed into a true beast at the moment. He observed Aomine's smirk, contemplating the change in him. Harasawa, their coach, made the decision. We'll start by giving Aomine the ball from the beginning. This announcement was met with collective sighs, the team resigned to following their coach's plan. Emiyoshi, with a small smile, was willing to honor Aomine's request, even if they were without a coach to decide. A thought crossed Emiyoshi's mind as he grinned, he's our ace, after all. Momoi felt a mixture of happiness and concern seeing Aomine's excitement to face a strong opponent, but her thoughts were cut short. She shook her head to refocus on her duties, reminding everyone, it's time to head to the court. Our match is about to start. With everyone ready and changed, they nodded in unison. The teams exited the changing rooms and onto the court, ready for their long-anticipated showdown with the tournament's dark horse. The crowd exploded in cheers as the teams stepped onto the court, their excitement palpable in the stadium. The stage was set for an intense battle, and both teams were eager to give their best. Whoa, the game is about to begin. The dark horse against one of the top contenders, hey! Any bets on the underdogs pulling off an upset? I'm rooting for the dark horse, their victory would be legendary. What a joke! Aomine's the ace of the generation of miracles. Dark horse or not, he'll obliterate them. The stadium buzzed with energy as fans, draped in their respective team colors, passionately debated the outcome. It was a moment of high anticipation as the game was about to kick off. Excitement surged like a living entity, weaving through the crowd, and banners waved like war flags. The scent of hot dogs and popcorn lingered in the air, adding to the sensory overload. It was an exhilarating prelude to the epic showdown about to unfold. Standing across from each other, Aomine couldn't resist smirking at Tsuna and said, "You're finally back, hey? I was getting bored waiting for some real competition. This isn't about entertaining you, Daiki. I'm here to dominate." Tsuna shook his head as he responded. Aomine's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Well, let's see what you've got, Tsuna." The tension between them was palpable, setting the stage for an epic showdown. Chapter 91, Chapter 89, predicting his opponent's every step. "Hey there, Nijimura, it's been a while, hey." Emiyoshi greeted Nijimura, who appeared rather displeased by his presence. Nijimura, clearly not thrilled to see Emiyoshi, muttered under his breath, "What an irritating fellow." A sly grin crossed Emiyoshi's face as he responded, "Haha, you're as grumpy as ever, I see. Just make sure you keep your hands to yourself this time," Emiyoshi taunted, narrowing his eyes slightly. Nijimura refrained from replying this time, keeping his attention fixed on the referee approaching the court's center. Emiyoshi wisely chose silence as well. His gaze, however, couldn't help but shift toward Tsuna, standing opposite Aomine. He couldn't shake off the feeling of the overwhelming pressure exuding from them. The referee arrived at the center and signaled both teams to prepare for the jump ball. He wasted no time with all players in position and tossed the ball into the air. The ball hung in mid-air, and players from both teams leaped to snatch it. Mochizuki managed to secure the ball, wasting no time passing it to Tsuna. Tsuna, with a subtle smile, caught the ball and noticed the excitement in Aomine's eyes. As he began to dribble and advance, Aomine's presence loomed ever closer. "The only person who can beat me is myself, hey," Tsuna said. He locked eyes with Aomine, continuing, "Those are some arrogant words, aren't they, Daiki?" Aomine casually shrugged and retorted, "Well, it's how it is. If it bothers you, you'd better make sure not to let me down, Tsuna." Unfazed by Aomine's arrogance, Tsuna scoffed, and his dribbling speed surged. He weaved the ball around, and Aomine stayed right on his heels, vigilant and relentless. Tsuna couldn't help but think, I have to give it to you. You're pretty formidable. With a wry smile, Tsuna shook his head and remarked, well, it's not like I can't find an opening. He swiftly put his plan into action. Tsuna's body darted to the right, a lightning-quick move that caught Aomine by surprise, revealing Tsuna's exceptional agility. Aomine, however, wasn't one to back down. He quickly adjusted and mirrored Tsuna's movements. But just as Aomine thought he had regained control, Tsuna swiftly changed direction, cutting left and racing towards Tou's defensive line. Aomine was left momentarily bewildered, pivoting to give chase, struggling to keep up with Tsuna's relentless pace. In response to Tsuna's rapid advance, Tou Academy's defenders quickly shifted to form a defensive wall, determined to halt his progress. Aomine, with a hint of annoyance, barked, clear the path. This is between me and him. However, Tsuna effortlessly weaved through the defensive line, leaving them grasping at thin air. In a swift, fluid motion, he scored the game's first 2 points, much to the awe of the spectators. The entire stadium roared with excitement. Unbelievable! Aomine, the ace of the generation of miracles, couldn't even stop him. The crowd was abuzz with chatter and amazement, their enthusiasm filling every corner of the stadium. A tall teenager with green hair and thick black glasses adjusted his frames while keeping his eyes on the match between Fukuda Soo and Tou Academy. Midorima. You're here too. Midorima was taken by surprise when Kaijo, a blonde teenager, approached him with a grin. He inquired, how did you recognize me, Kaijo? Kaijo sheepishly scratched his head, wearing a wry smile. He couldn't help but think that anyone who couldn't spot Midorima, even with his rather lousy disguise, must be a bit of an idiot. With a chuckle, Kaijo responded, haha, I guess I've got a keen eye. Midorima simply shook his head and redirected his attention to the ongoing match. Kaijo casually shrugged as he positioned himself next to Midorima, his gaze fixed on the unfolding match. With a hint of admiration, he questioned, he's really that good, isn't he? In Kaijo's view, he had witnessed Tsuna's skills in action, which were on par with Aomine's. Guess that's why Aomine was so hyped to face him. More than facing me, Kaijo concluded, clenching his fist with a mix of frustration, respect, and determination. In the intense game, Aomine swiftly gained possession of the ball, dribbling it with remarkable speed. Standing before him, Tsuna couldn't help but chuckle, noting, eager, aren't you? Aomine didn't reply, focused on maneuvering the ball with finesse as he attempted to find a gap in Tsuna's solid defense. Yet, Aomine quickly realized that Tsuna's defense was unyielding. Despite his skillful maneuvers, he couldn't penetrate the core of Fukuda Soo's defensive formation. The players from Tou Academy wore expressions of astonishment. Sakurai couldn't hide his surprise as he exclaimed, someone like Aomine got pressured like that. Not quite yet. Miyoshi, however, shook his head and calmly stated. Aomine continued his advance, and Tsuna shadowed his every move. They reached the right end of the court, where Aomine sported a confident grin. He thought, no big deal, I'll work from the side. Seeing Aomine didn't even slow down his pace, Tsuna frowned. He signaled to Nijimura, ready to inbound the ball. Aomine jumped high above the end line, twisting slightly in the air before unleashing an unconventional throw. Tsuna couldn't help but remark, you've got a few tricks, hey. The ball followed a high arc from the end line, landing flawlessly in the center of the basket. The crowd erupted with cheers once more. It seemed like Fukuda Soo had seized the momentum momentarily, but Aomine, known as the ace of the generation of miracles, wasn't about to let Tsuna's display go unanswered. Tsuna swiftly advanced without a word. Miyoshi noticed this and yelled, get back into position. Aomine, too, reacted promptly, hot on Tsuna's heels. Yet, Nijimura was ahead of them as he tossed the ball in Tsuna's direction. With the ball in hand, Tsuna scanned the Tou Academy players ahead of him, thinking, Miyoshi's quick to catch on, as expected. Tsuna's dribbling was impeccable as he confidently pushed forward, declaring, but these guys aren't sufficient. Tou's players clenched their jaws, making desperate attempts to halt Tsuna's progress. Yet, his agility and dribbling skills proved too much for them to contain. Wakamatsu couldn't help but feel frustrated. It seemed like he had Aomine on the opposing team as Tsuna expertly slipped through his defense. Don't take me lightly, Tsuna. As Tsuna deftly navigated past Tou's defense, Aomine arrived in time to intercept his path. But Tsuna's response was a smirk at this. Instead of attempting to bypass Aomine, he executed a graceful fadeaway jump shot, catching Aomine off guard. Aomine's eyes fixed on Tsuna's nimble footwork. In a smooth motion, Tsuna released the ball, sending it soaring in a perfect arc before it gracefully swished into the basket. Imyoji's eyes widened in astonishment. He deliberately slowed down just after slipping past our defense to set up that fadeaway, even with Aomine right on him. It was a move that seemed almost otherworldly in its precision. Tsuna had reduced his speed so subtly that it barely registered, a cunning maneuver to execute the shot without risking an injury. That guy read Aomine like a book. Imyoji regarded Tsuna as if he'd just witnessed a supernatural feat. Such calculated plays were nearly impossible in the whirlwind pace of this game unless Tsuna could predict Aomine's movements with pinpoint accuracy. The crowd responded with an uproarious cheer. The battle between Fukuda Soo and Tou Academy's star players had electrified the entire stadium. The audience's excitement filled the air, their enthusiastic cheers reverberating throughout the arena as they witnessed this intense face-off. Chapter 92, Chapter 90, Beast Instinct. Amidst the roaring stadium crowd, Midorima and Kai silently observed the unfolding spectacle. Both wore expressions of astonishment as they took in the game. The match has barely started, and they're already pulling off incredible moves, Kai's remarked, speaking loudly enough for Midorima to catch his words. Midorima adjusted his glasses and commented, "This game resembles yours, Kai's." They're both highly eager to face each other. Kai's eyes widened in surprise, and he inquired, "Did they used to have one-on-one matches too?" "That's right," Midorima confirmed, glancing towards a specific section of the audience where he noticed a red-haired teenager with a wide smile, seemingly enjoying the game. "Did you see that, Ryo?" Akashi. Kotaro couldn't contain his amazement at the display of skill from Tsuna and Aomine. Mibuchi nodded, acknowledging the incredible talent on the court. "Indeed, they're both exceptional players, aren't they?" A hint of concern lingered in Mibuchi's eyes as he watched the game unfold. As he observed Akashi, who appeared to be thoroughly enjoying the match, Mibuchi couldn't help but think, "I get it now." He also warned us to be cautious of Fukuda Soo's captain. "Whoa, the game's underway, hey?" "Ha ha ha." A hearty laugh resounded as the group turned to find their teammate, Nebaya, had finally arrived. "You're late, Nebaya," Kotaro grumbled. But Nebaya laughed heartily and apologized to Akashi before joining them to watch the game. Back in the game, Aomine couldn't help but chuckle with glee as he observed Tsuna's retreating form. Imyoji got hold of the ball as the game pressed on. Sensing Aomine's enthusiasm, he didn't waste a moment and passed the ball to him. As the game unfolded, Tou Academy's coach couldn't help but notice that it had turned into a one-on-one showdown between Tsuna and Aomine. Harasawa turned to Momoi with a question. "Momoi, did you give Kazama's data to Aomine?" Momoi offered a wry smile and shook her head. Aomine turned down the data just like usual. Harasawa's expression darkened. The game wasn't playing out as they had hoped. Tsuna had an uncanny read on Aomine, making it challenging for him to score. Even their collective defense couldn't contain Tsuna's skillful maneuvers. As time passed, Fukuda Soo held a slight lead in the first quarter, scoring 26-20. Both teams retreated to their benches, gearing up for the second quarter. On Fukuda Soo's bench, everyone appeared focused and ready. Agiwara wore an appreciative grin. "Aomine is truly something, isn't he? A class of his own." The others agreed, understanding the exceptional skill Aomine possessed. "Tsuna, maybe we should just let you and Aomine have your one-on-one match," Nijimura teased, recognizing the intensity of the showdown between the two. Tsuna simply shook his head with a smile. The others chuckled along at this. Observing Aomine across the court, who seemed to be grinning wider than usual, Tsuna wondered aloud, "Shozo, doesn't he look strangely familiar?" "What do you mean?" "Of course, he's familiar. We're all from Tiako," Nijimura replied, puzzled by Tsuna's comment. Tsuna shook his head, trying to explain further. "No, it's not about Tiako. Daiki, he's the kind of player we know well." Everyone on the bench turned to scrutinize Aomine more closely, attempting to discern what Tsuna was getting at. Agiwara's eyes widened as they observed, and he turned to Tsuna. "Can it be true? He's already like a monster." Agiwara questioned in disbelief. "Well, what's your take on it?" Tsuna grinned and left it to their imagination. On the other side, Tou Academy remained largely quiet. They found it challenging to get into the game, thanks to the intense pressure Tsuna was putting on their ace, Aomine Daiki, who was a member of the Generation of Miracles. Sakurai voiced his thoughts, it's like playing against another Generation of Miracles player. Momoi, well aware of Tsuna's incredible skills, shook her head. If Tsuna had remained in Japan, he could have easily earned a place among the Generation of Miracles. But now wasn't the time to dwell on that. She turned to their coach, Harasawa, and inquired, "Coach, should we adjust our strategy a bit?" If they continued to focus solely on Aomine, they knew they couldn't change the course of the game. However, Aomine was getting into the flow and seemed to enjoy the match more than anyone. He grumbled before saying, "Keep passing me the ball. This is getting exciting. Just don't interfere." Wakamatsu was furious at Aomine's attitude and stood up, questioning him, "What the heck are you saying?" Aomine's icy glare sent a shiver down Wakamatsu's spine, triggering an internal alarm that screamed danger. It felt as though a predatory beast was locking eyes with him. Wakamatsu's eyes widened in astonishment. He had experienced this eerie sensation in the changing room, but now it was amplified, baffling him. What on earth? The rest of the team also sensed the change, with Momoi looking worried at Aomine. Harasawa picked up on Aomine's unrelenting desire to play and nodded to Imiyoshi, conceding, "All right, let's go with your approach." Imiyoshi couldn't help but shiver when he looked at Aomine. Then, he turned his attention to Tsuna, thinking, "Looks like you've unleashed a beast, Tsunayashi Kazama." As the second quarter kicked off, Agiwara passed the ball to Tsuna. Aomine was in Tsuna's face from the get-go, marking him closely, like a shadow. Aomine's silence was enough of a response for Tsuna. He picked up his pace and maneuvered to Aomine's left side, making the defense chase. Aomine shadowed Tsuna closely, mirroring his every step. But Tsuna had a plan. He altered his course with a swift body rotation and darted to Aomine's right. He believed he had outwitted Aomine's defense. However, a sudden presence behind him made Tsuna's instincts kick in. He quickly stepped back as an opposing hand reached for the ball he held. Tsuna's maneuver hadn't worked, and Aomine was right back in his defensive stance, blocking Tsuna's path. The players from Fukuda Soo couldn't believe their eyes. Kaijo expressed his frustration. What in the world was that? He clenched his teeth, knowing he'd never pushed Aomine this hard during their previous match. Midorima shared in the surprise, adjusting his glasses before describing how Aomine's movements resembled a wild beast's. "Beast instinct, hey? Seems like you're getting serious, Daiki." Tsuna sported a sly grin as he faced Aomine, noticing how Aomine's defensive stance now appeared more natural and at ease. Imiyoshi, even though he had a hunch, found himself genuinely surprised. He squinted his eyes slightly and quietly pondered, Aomine's instincts have dulled since he stopped taking things seriously. Even when playing against Kaijo, he never had to dig deep and unleash his full potential. Watching Tsuna dealing with Aomine's now intense defensive form, Imiyoshi grinned and expressed his gratitude, "Thanks to you for bringing out the beast in him. Our team just got a lot stronger." Chapter 93, Chapter 91, title at the end of the chapter. Agiwara fell into contemplative silence as he observed the ongoing spectacle. Their previous quarters showdown had already filled him with awe, and now it seemed like there was even more to uncover. "I've got to step up my game," he thought resolutely. It was his unshakable resolve to keep playing, to avenge what these basketball monsters had done to his love for the sport. Agiwara knew he'd be swiftly overpowered unless he improved. Tsuna faced the challenge of trying to pierce Aomine's relentless defense, and he swiftly recognized that it wouldn't be a walk in the park. "This is going to be tough," Tsuna muttered under his breath. He executed a quick crossover to the left and pivoted in the same direction, hoping to create some space. But Aomine, akin to a predatory beast, was relentless in his pursuit, shadowing Tsuna's every move. This time, Aomine managed to swipe the ball away. With the ball in his possession, Aomine moved past Tsuna's defense and infiltrated Fukuda Soo's defensive line. The players from Fukuda Soo were ready to thwart his progress, but Aomine proved to be unstoppable. Tsuna raced to catch up with Aomine, but the latter appeared to have an uncanny awareness of a looming threat behind him. Swiftly sidestepping, Aomine executed one of his unconventional, formless shots that swished through the basket. Nijimura clenched his teeth, "Those unorthodox shots are simply incredible." While Tsuna had been able to slip past Aomine's defense occasionally, the tables had turned since Aomine unleashed his beastly instincts. As the game unfolded, Aomine relentlessly hindered Tsuna's attempts to make a comeback. As a result, Tou Academy managed to level the score with Fukuda Soo shortly after. Observing the expressions on his teammates' faces, Tsuna wore a concerned frown and directed his gaze toward the bench. He locked eyes with Alexandra and signaled for her to call a timeout. Alexandra acknowledged his gesture, and shortly after, the referee signaled for a timeout. At this point, Tou Academy had managed to pull ahead in the score. As the Fukuda Soo team took their seats, Alexandra, their coach, remained silent, awaiting Tsuna's guidance. With a calm demeanor, Tsuna didn't utter a word but exchanged nonchalant glances with his teammates. "Why? You think we're losing control?" The question hung heavily in the air, and Tsuna's teammates understood his discontent, which rendered them silent. Tsuna, acknowledging their silence, shook his head. His eyes drifted to Aomine and his confident team on the opposite bench. With a commanding presence, he began to speak. "Concentrate on the game. I won't accept any lapses in your focus," he declared firmly. His words had an impact, and his teammates' eyes widened as they recognized their mistake. Aomine's impressive skills had left them awestruck and unfocused, but Tsuna's words were a wake-up call. "The game has only just begun. That was only the appetizer," Tsuna remarked, glancing at the scoreboard that showed 2 in the lead. Reinvigorated, his teammates nodded in agreement. On the opposing bench, Miyoshi couldn't help but notice the shift in Fukuda Soo's players' expressions. He mumbled to himself, "They should be rattled right now, and the timeout was well-timed, but..." Coach Harasawa concurred, indeed, but that young captain sensed it instantly and rallied them back to focus. Miyoshi couldn't help but slightly narrow his eyes as a realization hit him, but it wasn't the coach who called that timeout. He fixed his gaze on Tsuna, a frown forming. Miyoshi was starting to understand that Tsuna had full command over his team, which was a rather intimidating revelation. He voiced his thoughts, "Is that guy really a freshman?" Harasawa's concerns mirrored those of Miyoshi. It was an almost unbelievable feat, especially for a freshman. Seeking a solution, Harasawa turned to Momoi, who observed Aomine's intense concentration. He queried, "Momoi, is there anything you know about Kazama that might help us to keep the momentum on our side?" After a moment's contemplation, Momoi replied, "Tsuna's always been a calculating one, so he might not tap into that beastly instinct like Aomine." But then, her expression shifted, and she added, "But he never lost his smile, even when Aomine turned the tide. It was only when his team lost focus that he lost it. So, he definitely has something up his sleeve." She also pondered, "He's one of the very few people that I couldn't see through after all." They observed Tsuna, who had regained his composure and wore his usual expression as his team refocused. Everyone knew the game was far from over. Miyoshi frowned as he sensed something peculiar about Tsuna when they had momentarily seized momentum. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, and hearing Momoi's words only deepened his suspicion. Their battle was far from finished. As the referee blew the whistle, signifying the game's continuation, both teams were poised on the court. The game pressed on, the ball now in Aomine's capable hands. "Why do they have to interrupt this? It's getting fun. Don't you think so, Tsuna?" Aomine grinned as he dribbled the ball around, probing for openings in Tsuna's defensive stance while Tsuna diligently shadowed his every move. Tsuna responded with a chuckle but wore a serious expression, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I might not be able to use beast instinct," Tsuna thought silently as he tracked Aomine's every step. The longer they remained locked in this defensive standoff, the wider Aomine's eyes grew. An instinctive alarm echoed within him as he scrutinized Tsuna, who now exuded an overwhelming pressure that seemed to encompass his entire being. Aomine couldn't shake the feeling that someone was eyeing him like a predator stalking its prey, and that icy gaze bore down on him. Tsuna understood that rulers ought to retain their rationality to promote the prosperity of their subjects, and a conqueror must guard against indulgence while expanding their dominion. Tsuna's cold voice cut through the tense atmosphere. Similarly, a hunter cannot forsake his humanity to hunt his prey. A shiver coursed through everyone on the court. They felt it deep within their bones, the intensity of the pressure emanating from Tsuna. The players from Tou Academy wore expressions of shock and astonishment, their eyes widening in disbelief. In contrast, the Fukuda Soo team wore knowing smiles, understanding that Tsuna's declaration about the game had merely just started was not to be taken lightly. "I can feel it from up here." Midorima stared intently at the court below, his eyes wide with astonishment. His skin tingling with an eerie sensation, Kai's couldn't contain his curiosity. Midorima, doesn't this pressure remind you of someone? Midorima nodded in agreement and turned his gaze to a person in the stands. This individual wore a smirk, clearly aware of the tremendous pressure emanating from Tsuna. Midorima adjusted his glasses, contemplating the potential outcome of a face-off between these two forces. I wonder what would occur if they were pitted against each other. Back in the game, Aomine's grin broadened as he felt the mounting pressure. He swiftly shifted his body to the opposite side, sensing Tsuna hot on his heels. Aomine then took a step back before executing another quick crossover move. Nijimura marveled at Aomine's exceptional agility. It was a sight to behold. Yet, Tsuna shadowed Aomine's every step, keeping up with his extraordinary movements. Aomine's grin grew wider as he leaped to the side, rotating his body to take his formless shot. The ball left his hand with a confident flick. But to Aomine's astonishment, his shot was met by a swatting hand. He turned to see Tsuna, who had blocked his formless shot. A chill coursed down Aomine's spine as he met Tsuna's icy gaze. Tsuna coldly said, "Is that the best you've got, Daiki?" Title: Hunting a Beast. Chapter 94, Chapter 92, Returning to his former self. I can't explain it, but it sent shivers down my spine. Kotaro couldn't help but shiver, overwhelmed by the ominous aura radiating from Tsuna. It was an unsettling presence that he had never experienced before. He admitted to himself that he was intimidated by Tsuna, someone he had known only briefly. Mibuchi and Nebaya shared a similar sentiment, their expressions growing serious as they watched the court. Mibuchi couldn't help but notice a resemblance between Tsuna and Akashi. The aura Tsuna exuded was eerily similar to what they had felt from their captain. Glancing at Tsuna's figure on the court, Mibuchi thought to himself, but why do I feel that his presence is a lot heavier? In the heat of the game, Aomine was momentarily stunned by Tsuna's icy retort, but it only fueled his determination. He grinned defiantly, "Just getting started, Tsuna." The game pressed on, and Aomine maintained possession of the ball. With a deep breath, he launched the ball towards the basket, but Tsuna was lightning fast, extending his hand to deflect Aomine's shot. Aomine sensed this and smirked, quickly withdrawing his hand and clutching the ball once more. He made a decisive move to the left, targeting Tsuna's momentarily weakened side. With a sly chuckle, Aomine advanced. But to his surprise, his eyes widened as he realized the ball had slipped from his hand, and Tsuna was already on the move, snatching it away. Aomine reacted quickly, chasing after Tsuna as he surged forward, slipping past Tsuna's defense. Aware that Aomine was in hot pursuit, Tsuna decided to go for a dunk. Just as he leaped toward the hoop, a looming presence appeared to his left. Aomine had swiftly moved to block his dunk. Tsuna's nimble move took Aomine by surprise. In midair, he smoothly adjusted his shot. Instead of heading straight for the hoop, he shifted sideways, leaving Aomine slightly stunned. Aomine's eyes widened as he realized the cleverness of Tsuna's maneuver. Regrettably for Aomine, he was too late to react. His body collided with Tsuna, who managed to release the ball just before the referee blew the whistle for a foul by Aomine. This granted Tsuna a free throw. Imiyoshi's expression turned intense, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He knew that such plays were expected when the generation of miracles was on the court, just as they had witnessed in their previous game against Kaijo. However, the spectacle against Fukuda Soo was on another level, leaving him to think, just what is it with these monsters? Wakamatsu watched in disbelief as he witnessed Tsuna orchestrating a turnaround even with Aomine putting in such a serious effort. Haizaki, however, couldn't deny the glaring gap in skill when facing Fukuda Soo. He felt a sense of admiration mixed with frustration and found himself in a situation similar to Aguilera, motivating him to push his limits in training. The game pressed on, and Tsuna confidently scored the free throw, keeping Fukuda Soo in the lead. Aomine struggled to find his usual scoring groove. Aomine, who had been wrestling with his inner thoughts, finally felt a sense of elation that had eluded him for a long while. A triumphant smirk played on his lips as he stuck to Tsuna like a shadow, thinking, "This is the feeling. Tsuna, you're the best." Aomine exclaimed, and Tsuna responded with a disapproving click of his tongue. Then, out of the blue, Tsuna launched an unexpected long-range shot that caught Aomine off guard, making it impossible for him to react in time. Without even glancing at the ball he released, Tsuna kept a stern gaze fixed on Aomine. Losing focus in the middle of a game, he remarked coldly. With a swift pivot of his body, Tsuna continued, "Don't hand me an easy win, Daiki. You're letting me down." Aomine's eyes widened at Tsuna's words. The ball soared smoothly and gracefully through the net, leaving everyone in two stunned. They wondered, did he just sink 3 shots like that? And did he really need to do that fancy spin before the ball went in? Is he trying to be Midorima? Wakamatsu couldn't help but think to himself. The referee's whistle signaled the end of the second quarter. Tou Academy stared at the scoreboard, frustration etched on their faces, as they saw the score, 56-34. Both teams headed back to their respective changing rooms. Aomine's mind was in turmoil, haunted by Tsuna's words. Did he say I'm disappointing? Aomine had buried this emotion deep in his memories, dating back to his middle school days. For so long, he had been the one to express his frustration, constantly lamenting that he couldn't find the thrill he sought, but today, the tables had turned. A laugh escaped his lips, echoing in the locker room. Aomine. Hey! Wakamatsu was shaking Aomine, bringing him back to reality. The next half was about to begin, and everyone suddenly noticed that Aomine appeared to be in a trance, laughing to himself. While the team was deep in discussion about their strategy against Fukuda Soo, Aomine appeared completely lost, prompting Wakamatsu to engage and shake Aomine to get his attention. Aomine looked around in confusion as if snapping out of a daze, noticing the irritated glares aimed at him. Hey? What? Miyoshi shook his head, reminding him, it's time for the next half. We need to get back on the court now. Don't tell me you didn't even listen to our discussion, you knucklehead. Wakamatsu muttered, his frustration evident. Aomine, suddenly aware of his inattentiveness, scratched his head in an awkward manner, saying, my bad. The room fell into an unusual silence, shocked by Aomine's rare apology. Momoi couldn't help but gasp, her hand over her mouth. She was suddenly reminded of the Aomine from their Chieko days. Tsuna's words about knocking sense into Aomine resonated in her mind, bringing tears to her eyes. Miyoshi, on the other hand, was perplexed. Aomine seemed like a new person. He pondered, just what in the world? Perhaps this could work in our favor. Returning to the court, both teams were ready to resume. The referee's whistle pierced the air, marking the continuation of the game. Aomine returned to the game with renewed focus. Yet, Tsuna's relentless pressure weighed on him, and Fukuda Soo managed to keep the lead. As Tsuna skillfully negated each of Aomine's moves, the passing of time felt stretched out, seconds elongating into eternities. As Tsuna nullified each of his moves, time seemed to stretch out, each second elongating into an eternity. Aomine, in the midst of this disheartening symphony of thwarted actions, experienced a sensation akin to drowning. Aomine felt himself descending into the depths, and an unusual contentment washed over him. It was as though he relished the descent, each step pulling him further from the surface. He journeyed ever deeper, with an almost childlike enthusiasm in his strides. Finally, he reached an enormous, looming door that dwarfed him, an awe-inspiring presence that seemed to beckon him inward. This is the moment. After all that waiting. Finally. Aomine mumbled with a smile as he placed his hand on the doorknob. His muscles tensed as he pushed the door open with determination. Chapter 95, Chapter 93, Entering the Zone. As Tsuna managed to slip past Aomine's defense, he suddenly sensed a looming presence behind him. His eyes widened as he watched a hand swat the ball from his grip. The air seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Players from both teams gaped in astonishment at Aomine's dominating move. Alexandra, watching from the bench, leaped to her feet in response. Her expression was one of utter disbelief as she contemplated, to believe that such incredible talents exist in Japan. Is this why Tsuna returned? Aomine's eyes sparked with electricity as he pursued the ball, charging forward with incredible speed. Tsuna didn't allow his initial shock to hinder him, he swiftly reacted and chased after Aomine. Fukuda Soo's other players quickly formed a defensive strategy against the advancing Aomine. Tsuna had noted beforehand that Aomine never passed the ball, rendering marking other players futile. Aomine's face remained calm, but his eyes were streamlined with dark blue sparks. He effortlessly penetrated their defense before they could react, executing a thunderous slam dunk reverberating throughout the stadium. The crowd erupted with cheers and applause, their excitement echoing throughout the arena. Midorima and Kai's wore expressions of disbelief. What in the world? Kai's muttered. Just when they thought they had seen it all, Aomine unveiled a performance that utterly stunned them. Midorima focused intently as he commented, it's usually almost impossible for anyone to give their absolute best in a game. Midorima recognized that even the most exceptional players often fell short of their full potential. But then, the zone changed that, Akashi stated as the others gathered around, hanging on his words. Achieving 100% of your potential sounds like a wild claim. Kotaro couldn't hide his astonishment as he stared at Aomine's figure. Mibuchi and Nebai wore equally incredulous expressions. Yet, the undeniable truth stood before them, it was real. Miyoshi initially flinched in surprise but swiftly composed himself, realizing the advantage they might gain from this revelation. A smirk crept onto his face as he contemplated, A&D. No one has ever witnessed Aomine's 100%. Alexandra had been on the verge of approaching the referee for a timeout. However, she stopped in her tracks, observing Tsuna's expression and choosing to let the game continue as it was. Tsuna, having regained his composure, let out a chuckle. Well, this is how it should be, Daiki. He sported a smirk, casting his gaze at Aomine, who had seemingly tuned him out, giving his undivided attention to the game. Tsuna believed he was starting to grasp what Aomine felt when confronted with a formidable adversary. It was undeniably thrilling. As the ball made its way towards him, Tsuna contemplated his next move. He signaled to his teammates to continue the game, thinking about the situation ahead. Tsuna controlled the ball with Aomine on his heels, the tension in the air palpable. Yet, Tsuna wore a self-assured grin and, like a seasoned dancer, began to dribble the ball at an astonishing speed. Can he really dribble that fast? Kotaro exclaimed, his surprise evident. As a player known for his rapid dribbling, Tsuna's agility on the court left him in awe. Mibuchi nodded in agreement, saying, did he deliberately hold back before? That's not surprising. Tsunayoshi wasn't the type to reveal all his strengths right away. He was holding back a bit. Akashi observed the game with keen interest. But it seems it wasn't sufficient. In another section of the stadium, Kai's looked puzzled and asked Midorima, why do you say that? Midorima adjusted his glasses and explained, the only way to counter someone in the zone is by entering the zone yourself. That's how it worked, and there was no way around it. Tou's players watched with wide eyes as Tsuna executed his nimble moves. Aomine, however, remained unfazed, tracking the ball's every motion with a keen gaze. Tsuna, noticing Aomine's unyielding focus, furrowed his brows. In a swift maneuver, he dribbled the ball behind his back and then smoothly crossed over to Aomine's right side. Miyoshi, a spectator to this spectacle, was duly impressed by Tsuna's agility. But his astonishment turned into disbelief when he saw the ball had vanished. Captain! On your left! Sakurai urgently cried out as the ball in Tsuna's possession had mysteriously appeared in Nijimura's direction. Nijimura prepared to receive the ball, but Tsuna, though slightly frowning, noticed a figure intercepting it and snatching it away before sprinting into Fukuda Sogo's defensive formation. Tsuna thought, Daiki didn't even fall for that, hey. Slicing through Fukuda Sogo's defense with remarkable ease, Aomine found himself beneath the basket. He leaped for a dunk, but Tsuna was there to thwart his attempt. Aomine, however, exhibited incredible agility, swiftly adjusting his movement and opting for a lay-up shot instead. Aomine scored and shot Tsuna a frown. Giving up already? He questioned, his voice sharp. Tsuna, perplexed, frowned back. What are you talking about? Then, don't run away again. Aomine shook his head in disappointment and returned to his position. Tsuna froze in his tracks, struck by Aomine's words. Nijimura, standing nearby, walked up to Tsuna and inquired with concern, Tsuna, are you okay? Even with Nijimura's show of concern, Tsuna let out a scoff. You know me better than anyone here. Do you think Daiki's words could rattle me? Nijimura nodded and seemed relieved. Tsuna gazed after Aomine, who was heading back, and quietly mumbled, but it's been a while since I was pushed like this. The game pressed on, and Aomine was on fire, leaving Fukuda Sogo's players in despair as they watched their lead being snatched by Tou. With the ball in his grasp, Tsuna dribbled it slowly, his mind racing to figure out the best course of action. Tsuna sensed that their team's morale would plummet if he didn't counter Aomine. He closed his eyes for a moment, and time seemed to crawl. Inwardly, he contemplated his next move. In his subconscious, his eyes fixated on the empty throne at the top of the stairs. Should I take that seat? He pondered. Sitting there would trigger his Conqueror's eyes, a power that could potentially change the game's tide. Tsuna let out a small laugh, saying, nah, that's too much. After his words, he felt a peculiar sensation, like he was engulfed by water, almost as if sinking beneath its surface. "Maybe I should explore this door," he murmured, facing a colossal and intimidating door that radiated an imposing aura. Just as Tsuna was about to reach for the door, there was a distinct click, and the door unexpectedly swung open, catching him off guard. "So, an invitation, hey? How intriguing." Tsuna chuckled as he ventured inside. Chapter 96, Chapter 94, title at the end of the chapter. Tsuna's behavior initially perplexed everyone on the court when he suddenly closed his eyes. Aomine, however, keenly sensed it. Tsuna had also accessed the door, stirring his anticipation. Soon, the entire court felt the change. Tsuna's once imposing aura had intensified, prompting them to widen their eyes in astonishment. Agiwara and Hizaki gaped in disbelief, their mouths hanging open, mirroring the reactions of their teammates from Fukuda Soo. Alexandra and Harasawa widened their eyes in shock on the bench. Nijimura initially found Tsuna's changes surprising, but he couldn't help but chuckle as he thought, "I thought he was about to use that. This is quite different, isn't it? I didn't know he could do this as well." When Tsuna reopened his eyes, his presence expanded to encompass the entire court. Two players sensed a stifling feeling beneath their skin, and a shiver crept down their spines. His eyes crackled with a dark streamline as he advanced, dribbling the ball forward. The echoes of the ball on the court seemed to intensify as everyone watched him in disbelief. However, Aomine quickly regained his composure and closed the distance between them. Tsuna wore a composed expression, but his movements were lightning fast as he skillfully bypassed Aomine's defense. Aomine was like Tsuna's shadow, following his every move, and their intense duel unfolded across the entire court. It was as if the other players were invisible, their presence overshadowed by this intense face-off. For those players standing on the sidelines, it felt like they had turned into mere statues, utterly forgotten in the heat of the moment. "But there's nothing we can do at this point," Imyoshi muttered, sweat pouring down his face. He squinted his eyes in sheer disbelief as he watched the astonishing display of skill by these two monsters. Even before they entered this heightened state, keeping up with their pace was already a Herculean task. But with both of them now in the zone, it was as if the other players on the court had become mere background scenery, overshadowed by the overwhelming presence of these basketball prodigies. Akashi couldn't help but chuckle in the audience as he watched the unfolding spectacle. He turned to Tsuna, his eyes gleaming with an unusual curiosity. "So, this is your secret weapon, Tsunayashi?" he remarked, genuinely intrigued. He found the match fascinating, and his eyes held a peculiar gleam, indicating his deep interest in the ongoing game. Standing beside Akashi, Kotaro, Mibuchi, and Nebaya were utterly astounded by the incredible display they witnessed on the court. They were known as the Uncrowned Kings, a group nearly on par with the Generation of Miracles. However, as they observed the ongoing showdown between Tsuna and Aomine, it was evident that they couldn't quite measure up to these exceptional players. Mibuchi wore a somber expression, his thoughts betraying his dismay. He watched as Aomine effortlessly scored another point with his formless shot and commented, "I used to think Akashi was the only exception." But now, seeing the astounding display before them, he couldn't help but add, "It appears that all of them are true monsters." The audience in the stadium was left utterly speechless, gripped by disbelief as they witnessed the incredible skills on display, rendering the stadium eerily silent. The game had distilled down to a head-to-head clash between Tsuna and Aomine. Their relentless back and forth made the scoreboard light up with points for their respective teams. Aomine displayed an uncanny knack for scoring from nearly any spot on the court, while Tsuna showcased an eerie ability to anticipate his opponent's moves. Kaijo couldn't contain his thoughts and vocalized, "So, this is Aomine at 100%. His determination surged as he clenched his fists, recognizing the fierce competition unfolding before him. He came to a humbling realization that he had a steep climb ahead. Kaijo's eyes glinted with determination as he pondered, "Could I ever compete with them if I managed to perfect my abilities?" Midorima stayed silent, his thoughts churning. He had already reconciled with the fact that Tsuna hadn't employed his full power in their friendly match. But now, learning that Tsuna was still hiding many hidden cards left a bitter taste in his pride. However, Midorima adjusted his glasses, pondering, why is Nijimura surprised by this? He knew Nijimura had long been under Tsuna, and that guy should understand Tsuna better than anyone else. So why the surprise? Could it be that Tsuna hadn't shown his full hand yet? That possibility sent a shiver down Midorima's spine. He clenched his fist, resolute in his determination to improve for the upcoming winter season. The next time we cross paths, Tsuna, Midorima silently vowed, I'll uncover the truth. The game pressed on, and the entire focus was on their star players. Momoi watched with concern, aware that giving their all like this had its physical consequences. Beads of sweat trickled down both their faces, soaking their jerseys. She clenched her fist, anxious about their well-being. Checking the time, Momoi turned her attention back to the court, knowing that the outcome of this intense battle would soon be determined. It's going to come down to the winner between these two, she thought. In the midst of the thrilling game, Tsuna had the ball, and Aomine was hot on his heels. Tsuna swiftly moved to Aomine's right, and Aomine mirrored his steps. But then, Tsuna stepped back and suddenly slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing at Aomine's grin. He remarked, Daiki, getting excited is one thing. But, you're practically in your last breath at this point. Tsuna took a more relaxed dribble, deliberately shortening the gap between him and Aomine. Aomine couldn't help but let out a scoff. His face lit up with wild enthusiasm. Ha, what are you going on about? This is getting even more thrilling. Tsuna simply shook his head, and then his rhythm shifted instantly. The ball weaved between his hands, zipped beneath his legs, and darted behind him in a mesmerizing whirlwind. Aomine maintained his grin as he engaged his instincts to the fullest. He reacted purely on instinct, tracking the ball's rapid blur as Tsuna moved swiftly to his right. But Tsuna abruptly changed direction, leaving Aomine caught off guard. In the blink of an eye, Aomine lost his balance, stumbling and crashing onto the court. Memories of their initial one-on-one match in Teako flooded back, leaving Aomine in wide-eyed astonishment. The entire court fell into a moment of stillness when Aomine hit the floor due to Tsuna's maneuver. Whether it was the players on the court, the referee, the coaches, or even the spectators, all were gripped by disbelief. Aomine raised his eyes to meet Tsuna's, but he found a chilling gaze that seemed to bore into his very core. He tried to speak, to find words, but they stuck in his throat as he understood the weight behind that gaze. You've become pathetic, Daiki. Dribbling past Aomine in a casual yet decisive manner. Tsuna's words, delivered with icy precision, penetrated Aomine's being. Title: The Final Showdown. Chapter 97, Chapter 95, title at the end of the chapter. Sakurai's eyes widened as he stared at Aomine sprawled on the court. The rest of Tou Academy's players wore expressions of shock, sharing the same disbelief. Wakamatsu couldn't help but think, Aomine got played like that? That monster! Imiyoshi, still recovering from the surprise, yelled urgently at his team, get back in position. He's not done. His command shook them out of their astonishment. Sakurai, Wakamatsu, and Susa exchanged determined glances and quickly repositioned themselves, ready for Tsuna's next move. While Tsuna controlled the court, Aomine lay on the floor, Tsuna's words echoing in his mind. Pathetic, he called me. Aomine mumbled, initially in disbelief. But gradually, disbelief transformed into fury. His eyes glinted with intensity as he roared, even if it's you, Tsuna, how can you dare to call me pathetic? His shout went unheard amid the focus on Tsuna, who possessed the ball. However, Momoi winced, a pained expression crossing her face upon hearing Aomine's frustrated outburst. Filled with fresh resolve, Aomine tried to get back on his feet, keeping his gaze on Tsuna, who effortlessly outmaneuvered Tou's defense. Yet, his determination was met with a sudden, searing pain coursing through his entire body, causing his legs to crumple beneath him. Aomine's eyes widened in astonishment as he tumbled back to the floor. What's happening? Aomine muttered, his voice tinged with confusion as he grappled with his unresponsive body. As Momoi continued to watch Aomine, she pieced together the situation. Her eyes welled up, and she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle her tears. Harasawa, sensing something amiss from Momoi's reaction, darkened his expression and headed over to the coach's stand to request a timeout. Tsuna, fully aware of the unfolding situation, pressed forward. He skillfully eluded Tou's defense, soaring into the air for another thunderous dunk that snapped the spectators out of their daze. The crowd quickly recovered from their initial shock, and a wave of excitement rippled through the stadium as they realized the incredible play unfolding before their eyes. Tsuna remained unfazed by the thunderous cheers engulfing the stadium. His focus was solely on Aomine, who struggled to regain his footing. Aomine's body betrayed him, repeatedly crumbling to the floor in a desperate attempt to rise. It was a heartbreaking sight for Momoi, who looked on from the side as Aomine refused to accept defeat, making one valiant yet futile effort after another. The referee called for a timeout, and the entire two teams snapped out of their collective shock. They rushed to Aomine, who clearly needed assistance, while Momoi, sobbing loudly, hurried to his side. Tsuna felt a twinge of guilt when he saw Momoi's tearful expression, but he shook it off and headed back to his bench with his team. Taking their seats, Tsuna's teammates fixated their astonished gazes on him. Their faces clearly mirrored their disbelief. Tsuna shook his head. Stop gaping, guys. Need a reminder to get back in the game. He glanced at the opposing team's bench and continued, this game isn't over. Nijimura shifted his attention to Aomine, who had been brought over to Tou Academy's bench by his team. He questioned, I doubt their coach will let Aomine continue playing in this condition. Tsuna nodded in agreement. However, Tsuna's eyes flashed with a glint as he watched Aomine struggle to get back on his feet. Aomine had forsaken his rigorous training regimen since losing his fervor for basketball. He felt there were no more adversaries worthy of his full potential. However, neglecting his training had a price. It meant his body couldn't perform at its peak. Although entering the zone could force his body to perform to its fullest, to confront an opponent of Tsuna's caliber under these circumstances was akin to a death wish. Tsuna rose to his feet, capturing the attention of everyone in the room. He declared, let's stick to the plan we discussed in the locker room. Nijimura and the rest of the team blinked in surprise as they remembered the strategy they had crafted for this quarter. This even prompted Haizaki, who rarely shared his thoughts, to speak up with a look of astonishment. He asked, did you actually predict this turn of events? Tsuna shook his head, ignoring the question. Instead, he turned to Nijimura and said, there's a slight adjustment. I want you to switch with me. What? Why? Nijimura asked, his head slightly tilted in confusion. Just do as I say. Tsuna replied, eyes scanning the stands and spotting a red-haired teenager in the audience. He fixed his gaze on those standing beside the young man and continued, and this time, I need you to give it your all. Nijimura was initially taken aback, but soon, an excited grin spread across his face. He was eager to showcase his skills. Meanwhile, on the Tou Academy bench, a contrasting atmosphere enveloped the team. Aomine struggled to stand, gritting his teeth in frustration. He glared at Coach Harasawa, insisting, Coach, I can keep playing. Tears streamed down Momoi's face as she watched, unable to say a word to dissuade Aomine. Wakamatsu was ready to confront the situation when Emioji intervened, placing a restraining hand on him. Wakamatsu turned to look at Emioji and, although disgruntled, refrained from causing a scene. Coach Harasawa wore a deep frown. The reality of Aomine's condition and their dwindling chances of victory settled heavily on him. Ideally, they should replace Aomine to prevent further strain and potential injury. However, the piercing gazes from Aomine made Harasawa realize that although Aomine was often unpredictable and unreliable off the court, he carried immense pride. Halting him now might lead to lingering resentment, which would be detrimental to the team. Aomine was their ace, and unity was crucial. Harasawa sighed and reluctantly relented, cautioning Aomine, all right, but the moment I sense you're pushing yourself too far, I'm pulling you out, no matter what you say. The rest of the Tou Academy team didn't protest. Their coach's decision was non-negotiable. They could do little, and even Emioshi, who might have been their voice of dissent, seemed to agree with the coach. They had no choice but to accept it. With the referee's whistle echoing through the stadium, the game resumed. Emioshi took control of the ball, skillfully dribbling it down the court. He eyed the Fukuda Soo defense, noticing a shift in their positioning that made him widen his eyes. Aomine, despite his struggling condition, also picked up on the change, and he gritted his teeth in frustration. His gaze darted to Nijimura, who was guarding him before he shouted in Tsuna's direction. How dare you? Tsuna, don't you fucking dare to run away from me! Aomine's shout echoed with anger. In response, Tsuna fixed him with a cold, piercing gaze that sent shivers down Aomine's spine. This was a look he hadn't seen from Tsuna before, a gaze that seemed to regard him as worthless. The frigid stare doused Aomine's fiery fury, and he watched as Tsuna slowly opened his mouth. Don't tell me what to do, Daiki. Besides. Tsuna retorted, his voice cutting through the court's charged atmosphere like ice. His words reverberated, reaching everyone present. Are you even worthy now? Tsuna questioned, his gaze fixed on Aomine. His words carried a weight that seemed to freeze the entire court, leaving an eerie silence in their wake as if the temperature had plunged. Title: You Are Not Worthy. Chapter 98, Chapter 96, Inevitable Outcome. Miyoshi made a pass to Aomine, advancing the ball. He had faith in Aomine's abilities to deal with Nijimura, even though Aomine had left the zone. But it wasn't just Aomine, Tsuna also appeared to be out of it. Miyoshi noticed that Tsuna's stamina had taken a hit after accessing the zone. Although Tsuna was in better shape than Aomine, it was clear he wasn't at his peak. As Tsuna moved to defend him, Miyoshi observed him keenly. Miyoshi, now tasked with guarding Tsuna, said, "You're being pretty tough on a friend, aren't you?" Those were some really harsh words. Tsuna brushed off Miyoshi's comment. "The only one who can beat me is me," Tsuna casually recollected Aomine's words. He shook his head and added nonchalantly, "He needs a reality check." Tsuna had a promise to keep to Momoi, to bring Aomine back to his senses, and he was determined to do just that. Miyoshi adjusted his glasses, deep in thought. He had once considered Aomine's arrogant words to be true in some sense, but not anymore, not since facing Fukuda Soo. Aomine, despite the throbbing pain in his muscles, clutched the ball and skillfully dribbled it down the court. His dribbling speed was remarkable, though not quite on par with his zone performance. Midorima and Kaijo watched Aomine dribble the ball in silence. Realizing the intensity of Aomine's face-off against Tsuna, Kaijo understood that Aomine had experienced far more agony than him. The mere act of standing definitely brought so much pain for Aomine, not to mention dribbling the ball with such speed. The strain on Aomine's body was almost unbearable. "Aomine is truly something," Kaijo whispered loudly, making sure Midorima caught his remark. Midorima gave an approving nod, recognizing that to pull it off would demand an extraordinary level of determination and mental strength, a quality that earned his deep respect. In a different section of the audience, the uncrowned kings also greatly admired Aomine's unwavering determination and resilience. However, in the midst of this silent appreciation, Akashi, watching their former Gyokko captain, noted that even with Aomine's remarkable efforts, it might not be sufficient. He also had improved that much since the last time I've seen him, hey. Akashi thought to himself, closely observing their ex-captain's naturally formidable and aggressive defensive stance. Kotaro discreetly pointed something out, saying, "Nijimura's giving off a vibe like Aomine in the second quarter." Mibuchi and Nebaya exchanged serious glances. They had been primarily focused on Tsuna, but now it seemed Nijimura was also proving to be a significant force on the court. Meanwhile, Aomine also picked up on this change. He couldn't help but notice Nijimura's calm demeanor and his natural play style. Is that some kind of beastly instinct? Aomine wondered. However, Aomine sensed a subtle difference and furrowed his brow. Midorima adjusted his glasses, carefully observing Nijimura. Something about Nijimura's demeanor felt unique. Kaijo wondered, why is he so similar to Aomine? Midorima pondered for a moment, considering Nijimura's demeanor. He felt Nijimura was like a seasoned veteran who had weathered many battles. He's akin to a chivalrous knight, a true warrior. Midorima remarked. On the court, Aomine just scoffed at Nijimura's unique aura. "I don't care. I'll break through and make Tsuna face me again." Aomine's determination blazed in his eyes as he moved quickly, shifting to Nijimura's right side with impressive agility. With his path open, Aomine pushed forward, but he sensed a looming presence behind him. A hand reached out to snatch the ball from his grasp. Aomine winced in pain, straining to move his hand faster and avoid that hand. However, Nijimura quickly reacted, closing in swiftly, his hand brushing the ball and making it slip off Aomine's hand. Miyoshi was taken aback. Aomine got stopped by someone other than Kazama. He thought in disbelief. As the ball slipped from Aomine's grasp, Miyoshi was too slow to react. Tsuna, on the other hand, had anticipated Nijimura's move and was already on the hunt for the ball. With a burst of speed, Tsuna raced to seize the ball, silently acknowledging Aomine's resilience. Even in his weakened state, Nijimura couldn't contain Aomine's skills entirely. But that's more than enough. Tsuna exclaimed, snatching the ball. The opposing players were momentarily stunned but quickly recovered and scrambled to block Tsuna's path. His determination blazing, Wakamatsu yelled, "You won't pass me, you fucking monster!" Wakamatsu stood his ground, determined to block Tsuna's path. Tsuna, his dribbling skills resembling that of a graceful dancer, gently shook his head at Wakamatsu's efforts. Frustration gnawed at Wakamatsu as he struggled to keep up with the nimble ball. I'll stick to his every move then, he thought, trying to predict Tsuna's actions. Tsuna veered to the right, and Wakamatsu followed with all his might. But Tsuna had a cunning grin on his face as he unexpectedly halted and spun around, leaving Wakamatsu in a state of confusion. Wakamatsu's eyes widened as he realized the ball was no longer in Tsuna's hand. Sakurai! Miyoji's voice pierced through the daze, snapping Sakurai back to the game. He saw Mochizuki in possession of the ball and rushed to block, but it was too late. With a swift and perfect shot, Mochizuki scored a 3 for Fukuda Soo. God damn it! Miyoji cursed under his breath, the frustration evident on his face. Due to Tsuna's prior face-off with Aomine, he had put Tsuna as the same as Aomine, overlooking the distinctions between them that Momoi had told them beforehand. While Aomine was known for his solo style, Tsuna had consistently demonstrated himself as a cooperative and team-oriented player. As the third quarter concluded, Fukuda Soo had re-established their lead on the scoreboard, now displaying a score of 71-59. This situation dawned upon the Tou Academy members, who now realized that they were in a pinch. Harasawa told them to stick to their original plan based on Momoi's data to counter Fukuda Soo's players' tactics. They all nodded in agreement, not ready to throw in the towel yet. As the fourth quarter started, they quickly understood that even though they had figured out how to alter their rhythm to outsmart Hizaki and prevent him from shutting down their plays, it all went to waste without Aomine keeping Tsuna in check. Aomine also realized this as he clenched his teeth. Najimura's presence kept him in check, and he couldn't do much about it with his current condition. Miyoji understood that their defense was in a bad spot. They also noticed that their offense wasn't working as the game continued. Tsuna had switched places with Nijimura, and that caused problems for their attack. As they tried to catch up in the game by scoring 3-pointers, they noticed that Mochizuki and Aguera were closely guarding Sakurai. Miyoji turned to Tsuna, his frustration evident, as he realized their fate had been completely sealed. Akashi's smile vanished after observing these events and returned to his usual composed expression. He turned and walked away. Let's go, there's nothing more to see, Akashi declared. The rest of the group exchanged puzzled looks and followed him. Mibuchi glanced back at the court as he walked away, thinking, so, our final opponent will be Fukuda Soo Academy, hey. Chapter 99, Chapter 97, Going to the Final. The court was charged with tension as Tou Academy showed no signs of quitting. However, the reality was cruel as the referee blew the whistle, indicating the end of the game. As the eyes of every player and spectator fixated on the scoreboard, the stark contrast in the reactions of the two teams became evident. The players of Tou Academy wore expressions painted with a blend of disbelief and deep-seated frustration, their features contorted in a mixture of shock and irritation. On the other side, the members of Fukuda Soo couldn't contain their joy, their faces illuminated with the radiant glow of happiness. Upon seeing the scores displayed on the board between the two teams, the crowd erupted with jubilation, filling the entire stadium with an electric atmosphere. Excitement rippled through the spectators, creating a vibrant and thrilling ambience. Wow! 112-81. That's absolutely crazy. The Dark Horse pulled it off. They've really lived up to their name. Wait, weren't you supporting Tou earlier? Well, I support the winner, no matter what team it is. Ha ha ha. The stadium was abuzz with enthusiastic chatter and resounding cheers as fans celebrated the remarkable turn of events. Aomine's face turned vacant as he gazed at the scoreboard on the court. He quietly murmured, I lost, hey. Remembering his one-on-one during his time in Teako, Aomine thought, I used to be so excited back then, but why do I feel so choked up now? He clutched his chest, continuing his inner reflection. There was a jumble of emotions inside him that he couldn't quite fathom. It was his first defeat in a long time and losing wasn't something he'd anticipated. It hit him abruptly, like a shooting star streaking across the sky. That's so unlike you, Daiki. Could you stop making that face? You look horrible. A voice broke Aomine's reverie, and he shifted his attention to the person who had just defeated him. Tsuna? You're not here to make fun of me, are you? Aomine inquired weakly, his face still displaying a blank look. Tsuna shook his head and tossed the ball he held to Aomine, who caught it with a puzzled expression. It's not like this is the end. There is still the Winter Cup. You better start training this time, Tsuna advised before turning away and heading to celebrate their victories with his team. As he walked away, Tsuna added, don't let me down next time we meet. Aomine's eyes widened, and he looked at the ball in his hand. He clenched it tightly as his once blank eyes filled with determination. Watching Tsuna on the other side, smiling and praising his team, Aomine silently vowed to improve and beat Tsuna. Now that I thought about it, I've never managed to beat him. Aomine said to himself. Aomine, are you all right? Hearing the worried voice, Aomine turned to see Momoi coming toward him. Aomine chuckled and then returned to his usual self. He walked away, saying, he's as strong as ever. Wouldn't you agree, Satsuki? As Aomine's usual expression returned, Momoi sighed and nodded while looking at Tsuna. I'm going to get better, Aomine declared with a laugh. The next time we meet, I'll defeat him. Even though they had lost, Momoi couldn't help but feel a mix of happiness and surprise seeing Aomine in such high spirits. He's really back, she thought. She looked in Tsuna's direction with a thankful expression. Tsuna appeared to catch her gaze, so he turned towards her and replied with a kind smile, silently mouthing, I kept my word. In response, Momoi nodded and beamed with happiness as tears welled up in her eyes. She clumsily brushed away the tears with her hands while silently mouthing, thank you, Tsuna. The next match is between Murasakibara and Akashi, isn't it? Midorima mentioned as he observed both teams going through the post-game procedures on the court. That's tomorrow, right? I'm curious to see who comes out on top this time, Kai's remarked, remembering past events from their time at Teiko. Midorima pondered with a furrowed brow, tomorrow's game should be quite intriguing. Kai's fell into silence, then asked slowly, if it was Fukuda Soo against Rakuzan. Who do you think will win? Midorima was uncertain. In previous matchups like Aomine against Kazama, the historical record favored Kazama, so he was inclined to guess Kazama would win, which turned out to be true. However, this time, it was Akashi and Kazama. As much as he didn't want to admit it, Midorima couldn't envision them both losing. I don't know, but I'm certain it's going to be a game that was worth watching, Midorima replied, adjusting his glasses. Kai's nodded, and they both walked away, heading for the exit. In the assigned changing room for Fukuda Soo, the entire team was jubilant over their triumph. We're heading to the final. No doubt, we're taking the inter-high. Nijimura shook his head and advised, easy on the screaming. It's a pretty cramped space. This elicited a round of laughter from the team. They pulled Nijimura into their celebration, and soon enough, even Nijimura was cheering along. Tsuna wore a slight smile as he observed their celebration. Okay, team, we've had our fun. Time to leave. Tsuna said, bringing an instant hush to the room. They grumbled but started gathering their belongings. As they left, Ishida asked, can we keep the celebration going at the resort? Tsuna shook his head and turned to them with a gentle smile on his face. Strangely, they shivered and swallowed hard instead of feeling good about the smile. Let's save the celebration for after you all complete today's training. What? The entire group let out a collective exclamation, and only Nijimura maintained his composure. However, the corner of his mouth twitched in disbelief. Their outburst drew the gaze of onlookers, who pointed fingers in their direction. They had just defeated Tou Academy, one of the top contenders for the championship, instantly propelling them to the status of a renowned team. They offered sheepish apologies before resuming their walk. They cast imploring glances at Alexandra, their coach. Alexandra, however, laughed at their antics and received more pleading looks from the team. She waved them off before departing by herself. I swear, our captain's a real demon, one of them whispered among the group. The others shook their heads and whispered back, but our vice-captain is known as the Demon King. Our captain should be even more devilish, right? One looked contemplatively before suggesting, so, is he like a demon emperor? This isn't the moment for silly chatter. And he can hear you perfectly, you fools. Nijimura playfully smacked each of them on the head and scolded them. While observing them, Tsuna merely chuckled and pondered, maybe I should step up their training. Chapter 100, Chapter 98, Unexpected Guest. Amidst the dimly lit expanse of one of the resort's grand chambers, two figures sat across each other, locked in a battle of intellect. The room was adorned with opulent furnishings, giving the scene an air of sophistication. One of the players, seemingly disinterested, idly moved his pieces with an air of boredom. Young master, could you please go easy on me at least once? Nijimura, who had been caught in a whirlwind of complex moves, sat in silent astonishment, unable to think of any moves to get out of his current situation on board. Tsuna shook his head as he gracefully maneuvered his finger. His queen glided gracefully across the board, positioning herself directly before the opposing king. Flanking her were the loyal knight and the wise bishop, forming an impenetrable wall of strategy and precision. Checkmate. Nijimura let out a sigh, feeling disappointed. Another loss, hey. Nijimura wasn't really into chess, he wasn't much of a strategist. However, he had noticed that Tsuna always played the game by himself, so he decided to give it a shot. Unfortunately, he had never defeated Tsuna in any of their games. You just never catch on, Tsuna shook his head in disapproval. While he appreciated Nijimura's attempt to keep him company, he preferred playing solo since Nijimura didn't provide much of a challenge. Even though playing against himself usually ended in a tie, it helped him stay mentally sharp. Nijimura felt a bit embarrassed and scratched his head. He cleared his throat and then informed, "Young master, we've received an invitation to attend the annual gatherings." Tsuna's eyes flashed at this. He had heard of the gatherings from his grandpa's friend, who kept trying to betroth him with his granddaughter. It was a gathering for the younger generation, featuring individuals from influential families and prominent figures within the country. The event drew together the offspring of politicians, business magnates, and other influential people. Tsuna reached for his phone, curious about the news. He flipped open his phone, revealing a text message from someone asking, "Will you attend the annual gatherings?" A small smile formed on Tsuna's face as he responded, "I will." A reply immediately came in, saying, "In that case, I'll be there too." Tsuna chuckled with amusement while Nijimura observed his young master, perplexed. "He is really confident, isn't he?" Tsuna said audibly so Nijimura could catch it. Facing Nijimura, Tsuna ordered, "Let everyone know we'll be watching the semi-finals tomorrow. Pay close attention to Rakuzan's players." "Rakuzan? Are you that sure Akashi will beat Murasakibara?" Nijimura couldn't resist asking. Tsuna grinned, saying, "Certainly, their power balance is broken because Seijuro and Atsushi won't be in the game. With 3 uncrowned kings on their team, it's tough for Rakuzan to lose." Nijimura's eyes widened in shock at the news. Was this connected to the message Tsuna had received earlier? Understood. Even though Nijimura had plenty of questions, he obediently acknowledged. Observing this, Tsuna nodded and motioned for Nijimura to go to bed. Nijimura got up, offered a bow, and exited the room. As the door closed behind Nijimura, Tsuna was left alone, gazing out the window at the starry night sky. He mumbled to himself, "It'll be interesting to see his reaction later." The next day, Fukuda Soo took a break from their training to tune into the semi-final match between Yasen High and Rakuzan High. As expected, Akashi and Murasakibara didn't play, leaving most of the fans disappointed. Nonetheless, the game proved thrilling thanks to the standout performances of the uncrowned kings from Rakuzan. Although Tsuna had encouraged his team to attend the semi-final, he seemed to have other obligations because he didn't join them to watch the game. Nijimura couldn't help but shake his head. Tsuna always had a packed schedule, so he didn't dwell on it. Normally, as Saba's successor, he'd follow Tsuna, but Tsuna insisted he stay and watch the game because his role in the final held significant importance. Nijimura attentively observed the unfolding game, with Rakuzan taking the lead. He silently mused, "Those uncrowned kings are quite impressive." He had put extra effort into paying attention to their gameplay and tactics since Tsuna had also informed him that he wouldn't be playing in the final. Nijimura couldn't quite fathom why, but he knew that Tsuna had a prior commitment during the upcoming final game. Observing Hizaki and Agiwara, whose eyes were red from intense scrutiny of Rakuzan's play style, Nijimura was at a loss as he considered, what on earth did Tsuna tell these guys? Shortly, the game concluded with Rakuzan emerging victorious, prompting cheering throughout the stadium. Seeing Rakuzan's victory, all of Fukuda Soo's members turned to Nijimura, who simply nodded in acknowledgement. They headed back to their resort and resumed their regular training routine. Meanwhile, in the upscale Minato neighborhood of Tokyo, a district that was located in the heart of the bustling metropolis with lush greenery and meticulously manicured gardens that added a refreshing touch of nature to this urban oasis. A tall and imposing teenager with shoulder-length lavender hair that reached his back and violet eyes stood motionless in front of a fancy house in the neighborhood. He held a snack and nibbled on another while gazing at the house. All of a sudden, a car pulled up next to the tall teenager. The passenger side window rolled down, revealing Tsuna. He wore a speechless expression as he looked at the teenager and asked, "Atsushi, what brings you here?" Tsuna was aware that Murasakibara hadn't played in the semi-final. Still, he couldn't understand why Murasakibara was standing right in front of his main residence in Tokyo, out of all other places. As Tsuna looked at him, Murasakibara offered a casual greeting, saying, "Hey, Tsunakin, it's been a while." Murasakibara's gaze shifted from the elegant house behind him to Tsuna. His mouth parted, ready to speak, but then his eyes fixated on the open snack in his hand. A momentary pause cast an awkward air between them before Murasakibara shrugged off the awkwardness and resumed munching on his snack. The crispy sound of the chips echoed in the tranquil surroundings, a stark contrast to the elegance of the neighborhood. His gaze remained steady, and the bored expression that was practically his trademark remained etched on his face. "You really haven't changed, have you?" Tsuna managed a wry smile. Having finished his snack, Murasakibara appeared eager to continue his previous question. He started, "Tsunakin, is this your place? I can't remember well." "Yeah, it is. Do you want to come in?" Tsuna responded after a moment of contemplation. "So, you still have your snack collection?" Murasakibara inquired, revealing his real motive for visiting Tsuna. "So, the first thing you wanted from me after hearing I was back was my snack collection?" Tsuna shook his head, chuckling at the irony. Murasakibara simply nodded as if it were the most natural request in the world. Tsuna sighed and, stepping out of the car, motioned for Sabas to park it. He said, "Of course, come on in. I just got a fresh batch yesterday." Murasakibara's eyes sparkled with excitement as he followed Tsuna into the house, like an eager child anticipating a new toy. Big thanks to Gwigwi Isama for joining us as patrons. Your support means a lot to me, and I'm thrilled to have you on board. Person raising both hands in celebration. Do you want to read 15 chapters ahead of the schedule? Here's where you can find them. patreon.com/mythost.
Thanks for listening.